Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, aka the Football History Dude, and I'm here to tell you about an awesome way for you to rub elbows with your favorite podcast hosts here on the Sports History Network, while at the same time rooting for your hometown team this upcoming NFL season. You've been hearing all about our partner, Tailgate Fantasy, the past few weeks. Well, dig on this. Tailgate created a special Sports History Network league for our listeners, so we can put the word fan back into fantasy football together. It's free to join, and if you do so before the season kicks off, you'll automatically be entered into a drawing for a free t-shirt from one of our other partners, Home Field Apparel. It's a win-win-win! So hurry up today and head to sportshistorynetwork.com/tailgate for all the details. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/tailgate. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to yet another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I am Dan Newman, and I am joined, as always, by my brother and co-host, Andrew Newman. And Andrew, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing well, Dan. I'm excited to get into tonight's topic. I think it's one that there will be plenty of fruit to discuss. I know it's it's a little bit of a ways back, but I think between the National League season that year and horse racing and stuff, I think the 1898 year in sports is definitely one that bears a lot of interesting discussions that people might not be as familiar with.
Now, you know perfectly well that this isn't going to be 1998, not 1898.
Oh crap. So I don't need a lot of this then.
You're kidding.
No, of course I'm kidding. When you said we were going to open up with basketball in 1898, I don't even think basketball had been invented yet.
Incidentally, 1898, Boston Beaneaters 102-47, Baltimore Orioles 96-53. So
this is one of the few shows though where that's a plausible mistake to make. that we would be talking about 1898 instead of 1998.
You mean our podcast is one of the few shows where that's plausible to happen?
Yes.
I thought maybe you also meant that this is one of the few ones where theoretically we could be. I mean, if we were getting on to talk about 1951, and you wouldn't necessarily confuse that with 1851. So
no, yeah, I guess really the 1880s would be as far back as you could go with that, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. In all seriousness, this is we've done topics that I remember and was alive for and stuff, obviously, but this is the first one of these year retrospectives that I remember and was alive for. I think prior to this one, the most recent year that we covered was 86, right?
Yeah, we've done 1986. We did 1920. We did 1982. We did 1941. And I think later this year we want to do 1923, 100 years ago. So
I mean, I was born in May of 86. So this is it's the first one you remember either. You don't remember much of 1986, I wouldn't imagine.
No.
You'd have been 3. So
yeah. So this is the first one. I just thought the more I was thinking about it, if you think about 1998 in sports, it's 25 years ago, but there's really a lot of stuff there, including some things that I think maybe, get glossed over a little bit. But obviously baseball and basketball are the two big ones, but there's stuff in football, there's stuff in college sports, there's stuff in some of the individual sports. So I thought this would be a good one to revisit 25 years later.
The NBA, NFL, and MLB seasons are all things that we've touched on in previous years, like previous episodes. We've touched on aspects of these seasons, and they're all really fascinating subjects. And then obviously everything else, but especially for our show where that's the main 3 thrusts of what we talk about, really fertile ground, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So before we start, as always, you can check out the podcast on Facebook, Hello Old Sports Podcast. Just give us a search and you'll find us. Give us a like, maybe leave a comment, tell us how much you'd like the podcast, any suggestions, and you can also do the same by emailing us hellooldsports@gmail.com, and we will occasionally get an email from a listener or something like that, and they'll tell us, and we've actually done 1 or 2 episodes based on just suggestions from fans, so feel free to reach out to us in that way.
And as we get into this, just the usual caveat, we're talking about the sports year 1998. So that means NBA and NHL seasons that ended in 1998 and started in the fall of 1997. And it means the NFL season that started in 1998 and the playoffs being in January of 1999. So again, a distinction that to a non-sports fan wouldn't make a lot of sense, but to a sports fan, you know exactly why. So
exactly. We're basically looking at all the teams that would be considered the 98 whatever, I think is a good way to look at it. And I guess a good place to start is with the NBA season and with the final Chicago Bulls season of Michael Jordan and the second three-peat for the Bulls in 8 years and their second consecutive victory over the Utah Jazz in the NBA Finals.
Yeah, and a team that in the last few years has become known as the Last Dance Bulls, because that was the Bulls team that was the subject of The Last Dance, the ESPN documentary that I think aired it aired during like the heart of the COVID pandemic. So it was obviously going to be a big TV event either way, but airing when it did, it was one of the few things people had to sort of coalesce around and talk about.
It did, and it was in final production when the COVID stuff hit, and it wasn't supposed to air until sometime in the fall. And the producers, along with the folks at ESPN, they realized that this was not only a golden opportunity for them to have a, basically no competition for this documentary. They also realized that something that the country was really sort of aching for. And so, yeah, from April 19th to May 17th. So you're right. I think that you didn't really start to see restaurants and bars, even in sort of the very limited capacity. You didn't really see that till around Memorial Day. So that was that sort of 5-week period when there was literally just nothing but ordering takeout, walking the dog, and watching TV. And I remember my wife and I, all 5
I did a lot of drinking too.
My wife and I, well, you were also one of the few people who never worked from home. So you at least.
I thought you were going to say I was one of the few people who never watched the documentary either.
Well, I was going to get to that in a second. Yeah, you've still yet to watch The Last Dance. So
yeah. Go ahead. Were you saying something?
I was just going to say that my wife, Allison, and I, that was appointment TV every Sunday night for 5 weeks. We just, no matter what else was going on, which was admittedly not much, we would make a point to watch those 2 hours of The Last Dance. And it was really, really well done. There's since been a number of imitators: Jeter, Brady, Joe Montana, somebody else is I think Shaq did one with HBO that was a little, it was fewer episodes. I think it was like 4, and the Magic did one for Showtime. Maybe there've been a bunch. Last Dance is the best of them. I've watched the Jeter one. I thought it was pretty good. And I've actually really enjoyed the Joe Montana one because that's a guy that you don't really get a lot of, you don't hear a lot from him since his retirement 20 some odd years ago. But The Last Dance set the gold standard for what these documentaries and shows can be.
So I want to just, and we'll talk about others. The Bulls are going to be the main narrative of the 98 NBA season, but we'll talk about some other stuff. But I can't remember if I remember this from the time or if it's just sort of the lens of the past. I mean, I was 12, you were 15, so that's a big enough difference here. Was it apparent that whole year that was going, like, was it kind of well known that was going to be it for that team, that Jordan was going to leave? I mean, like I said, in my head, I have it that like, oh, we all knew this all along, but I don't remember if that's actually the truth or if that's just hindsight.
So the issue was, it was less about Jordan and it was more about Pippen and more about Phil Jackson. And Scottie Pippen, and this is in The Last Dance, among other places, Scottie Pippen very early in his career had signed a long-term contract that, and for those of you who don't know, Scottie Pippen grew up in a very sort of impoverished background. I believe it was one of his brothers was severely handicapped, and he was one of like, I don't know, I want to say 10 or 12 kids growing up in this poor black family in rural Arkansas. Went to a D2 school. He went to Central Arkansas. He was not a guy that was on anybody's radar as far as being drafted into the NBA. And so when he finally was drafted by the Bulls, when he finally made it to the NBA, financial security was very important to Scottie Pippen. So Pippen signs this contract, and I believe, just based looking at his salaries here, that he signs it in the 91 offseason. And making approximately like between 2.7 and 3 point something million. And this is an interesting contract because 93-94, he goes up to 92-93, he makes 3.4 million. But then by 94-95, he's back down to 2.2 million. So I don't know exactly what the specifics are, but the fact of the matter is that he's locked into this contract that has him paid much less than players who are much less decorated. So by 97-98, by that final season, which is also the final season of his contract, Pippen is really starting to make noise like he's leaving. He doesn't feel respected by the Bulls. And in fact, he's almost asking for a trade during the season, despite the fact that they're going for a third straight title. So he wants out, and Jerry Krause views this as Jerry Krause, who's the GM and sort of the architect of the Bulls dynasty, a guy who never gets along well with Jordan, never gets along well with Phil, really. Jerry Krause is sort of starting to make noise that he's going to let Pippen go. He's going to let Phil go at the end of the year. And then he's going to bring in a new coach and start to rebuild. The attitude is always sort of, okay, well, if Jordan wants to come back, we'll have him back. But we're moving on from Pippen. We're moving on from Phil. And then on the flip side, Jordan says, I'm not coming back if I'm not playing for Phil Jackson. So it's not necessarily a direct desire to just do it without Michael, but it's sort of understood that those guys are all a package deal. And if Jerry Krause and Jerry Reinsdorf, who's the owner of the Bulls, if they want to move on from Phil, especially, that means they're going to move on from Jordan as well.
Yeah, so it's sort of like interlocking pieces where, if they let Phil go, that's going to make them lose Jordan. If they let Pippen go, that's going to be more likely to, have them be less interested in retaining, and then, the third guy sort of in that whole thing is Dennis Rodman. And I guess the thought is sort of who the hell in 1998 can predict Dennis Rodman from 1 minute to the next.
And it's funny because Pippen sort of pulls one of these moves where he needs a surgery. I believe it's on his foot, and I can just verify that real quick. And he does a thing that actually that Shaq would sort of be known for with another Phil Jackson team a couple years later, which is basically Pippen needs surgery on his foot, but instead of getting it right away after the season ends, he waits. He actually plays in a charity game, much against the wishes of Bulls management, and then he gets this surgery that's going to cause him to miss a decent chunk of the season. He gets this surgery and he misses a significant part of the beginning of the 97-98 season. And Rodman realizes as a veteran that he has to step up and that he has to be sort of the second leader of the team along with Jordan. and lead this team while they limp along without Pippen. But once Pippen comes back, Rodman sort of really regresses. He needs a break. He disappears to Vegas for a little while. I think that this is the year when he starts really getting into the wrestling stuff, right? And he's missing practice to go appear on WCW TV. So, yeah, and in fact, by the time the playoffs roll around, Rodman's still an important part, but in the finals, or maybe it's the Eastern Conference Finals, I forget which series it is, Phil is kind of going away from Rodman. He's starting Tony Kukoc over Rodman. So, yeah, he's another one. By his third year with the team, he's starting to smell a little ripe, and they kind of realize that maybe it's time to move on from Dennis Rodman eventually soon also.
There is a little humor to imagine the scenario where everything is the same. Jordan retires, Pippen leaves, Jackson leaves, retires, not really whatever, but they bring Dennis Rodman back with that team the next year. I mean, I know that would never have happened, but there is a little humor in that. Suddenly would be on that team. But
that is one of the greatest lines from The Last Dance, is when they're at practice, and it's the practice is being recorded for the documentary, and Phil Jackson is really getting on Dennis Rodman, and he goes, "Dennis, what have you done to challenge your body today? What have you done to challenge your body?" And Jordan just goes, "His body made it here, Phil."
Despite all of that, they are still the mid-90s, late 90s Bulls. They're still very good. They, even without Pippen the first half of the year, they're 34-15 at the All-Star break. I believe it said they started 9-7, then they went on a 15-4 run. So by 15-4 run. So by the time Pippen returned, they were 24-11. They did lose Steve Kerr in January, so he was gone for the balance of that year. But, despite all of this, the Bulls are still the number one seed in the Eastern Conference. They're still, they win. I think they finished 62-20, so not that far off the mark of some of those teams a few years earlier than that.
The Bulls in Utah, who end up meeting in the finals, are both 62-20. They both lead their conferences at 62-20.
And as sort of an aside note, as a preview of the finals, the Jazz did beat the Bulls both times that year that they played in the regular season.
I did not realize that.
Yeah, I saw that as I was looking it up. So Jordan is the MVP of the league again. Is there any other NBA stuff that you want to cover? I mean, I have a few things, but before we get into the playoffs, any non-Bulls regular season related things that you think are worth getting into a little bit?
I want to talk a little bit about the Lakers, because this is Kobe Bryant's rookie year, and he ends up that Charlotte drafts him, and then he basically refuses to go to Charlotte, and they make the trade. Charlotte sends him to the Lakers. The Lakers send Vlade Divac, who'd been one of the leaders of the team throughout the 90s. And it's also the year Vlade Divac is expendable, because it's the first year. Is this the first year for Shaq? It is, isn't it? Yeah.
97, 98.
I think it is. Yeah.
That sounds right.
Because they make the finals in 95. And then I'm pretty sure that O'Neal is there 2 more years before they get rid of. 96, 97 is his. And I might be off a year. That might be hold on. That might be Kobe's first year too.
Yeah, 96, 97 was Shaq's first year with the Lakers. While you're looking that up, a couple of sort of things that are maybe a little lighter to
and that was Kobe's rookie year too. So it's Kobe's first All-Star year in 97, 98. It's his second year with the team.
Okay. And who was the coach of that team? Was that Del Harris?
That was Del Harris, and there's something I want to get into about that in a second as well.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Del Harris is the coach of this team immediately before they got one more year at Del Harris, and then they bring in Phil Jackson in the 99-2000 team. And Harris is just sort of a guy who he's trying to connect with his teammates or with his players, and he's kind of a Jeff Pearlman in his great book Three Ring Circus about those Lakers teams said that Harris is kind of a tough guy. He's kind of sad, and it says at the behest of his wife Anne, he hired a designer to create www.delharris.com, then charged visitors $20 for a 1-year membership that included these great benefits: an autographed photograph, an official Dell's Club membership card, a quarterly newsletter, and a birthday card. Fewer than 100 people subscribed.
I'm surprised it was that many.
Well, I didn't say how many fewer than 100.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. 8 is fewer than 100. I guess you give him the foresight for being the vanguard of the internet in the late 90s there, and trying to a subscription-based model, much like we see today. Maybe they should give that another try now. Is Del Harris still alive?
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think he is still alive. I'm not sure. Well, we haven't done him on In Memoriam these last.
You know where
years.
I can find out? DelHarris.com.
That's right. Like, I'd have to imagine that that's no longer operable. No,
he is still alive. No. He is 86 years old.
Okay. The domain DelHarris.com may be for sale for $12,000, which I don't think I have much interest in doing.
He's got to recoup that money somehow. And then
the only other thing is that Kobe makes his first All-Star game in the 97-98 series, and he sort of alienates his All-Star teammates a little bit. And this is from another book here. This is from a guy named Sean Devaney, who wrote a book called The History of the NBA in 12 Games. So he tries to take over the game. He takes 10 shots on his 11 touches in the first quarter. He does finish an alley-oop from Kevin Garnett, another guy who was straight out of high school. He kind of goes after Jordan defensively, but it also becomes clear that the other players are kind of annoyed at him. He waves off Karl Malone at one point when Karl Malone tries to set a pick for him, and Malone asks George Karl to take him out of the game, take Malone, take himself. Instead, Karl pulls Kobe Bryant. With 2:44 left in the third period, George Karl pulls Kobe out of the game in the third period. I don't know if I said third or fourth. And then Bryant sits the rest of the third and all of the fourth quarter. So he's kind of, with his cockiness. And if you know anything, or if you read anything about the career of Kobe Bryant in his early years, that's sort of a recurring theme of Kobe Bryant's early NBA career. Much like Jordan had 20 years earlier or 15 years earlier, he's really sort of alienating some of his fellow superstars with his arrogant attitude early on.
Yeah, and that's what led to sort of the end of their first dynasty in LA, and ironically after a three-peat, and just like what we're going to talk about tonight with Phil Jackson at the helm of that team too.
And Karl Malone plays a role in that too.
That's true too. A couple other things from this year, just sort of more peripheral things. This was the first year the Washington Bullets became the Washington Wizards in this season, and began in December playing their games in the MCI Center, Verizon Center, Capital One Arena, still where them and the Capitals play in downtown DC. Latrell Sprewell, PJ Carlesimo choking incident took place in this season when Latrell Sprewell in a Warriors practice left the floor, came back, choked PJ Carlesimo, was suspended for 68 games. You also had, I think, a significant thing to talk about was the rookie year for Tim Duncan of the San Antonio Spurs, who the Spurs have been a pretty good team, sort of a perennial second round team. The year before this, David Robinson gets hurt like a couple of games into the season. The Spurs drop like a stone. They end up winning the lottery and landing Tim Duncan, who would go on to see them through to 5 championships in his tenure there. And then the other thing I just thought is at least worth mentioning is this was the year of some interesting coaching moves. This was Rick Pitino taking over the Celtics with the hope of landing same in Tim Duncan. You had Larry Bird taking over in Indiana as the head coach of the Pacers, Chuck Daly in Orlando, and Larry Brown goes from Indiana to Philadelphia, where he would end up coaching a young Allen Iverson, and a couple of years later get them into an NBA Finals. So, some interesting movement there that I thought was at least worth giving in, like, setting sort of context for the season.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Pacers in a minute, because I want to just spend a minute on their 7-game Eastern Conference Finals series with the Bulls. I guess maybe we want to talk about what the Knicks do a little bit that year, because they have kind of an interesting season.
Yeah, I think this is always the we're always going to at least mention our local teams in this. One of them will get more coverage than the others in this particular episode, but so the Knicks actually struggle pretty significantly this year. They end up the number 7 seed.
But they were I don't know if you remember this. Sports Illustrated picked the Knicks to win the finals in this offseason.
That was boredom more than anything else. There was no reason to pick anybody but the Bulls to win the championship.
The one thing I'll say, though, is that this Knicks team was a really, really deep team. They were basically too deep at all 5 positions. Your starting lineup with Houston, Allen Houston, Charles Oakley, Larry Johnson, Patrick Ewing, and Charlie Ward was the point guard. But then they had John Starks off the bench, who'd been the 6th man of the year before, Chris Childs, and then they had 3 pretty good veteran forwards in Chris Mills, Buck Williams, and I believe this is Buck Williams' only year with the Knicks. He'd been there the year before. Then maybe it was Terry Cummings, whose only year. This was his only year with the team, because one of the guys, this was Cummings' only year. So they were expected. Now, again, obviously, you're right. It's laughable in retrospect that team would be able to compete with the Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, but people were thinking this team was going to be really good. And then it kind of all comes crashing down literally when about 25 games into the season, the Knicks are playing Milwaukee and Ewing gets fouled by Andrew Lang, breaks his wrist. And I remember even at the time they were saying that it was the severity of this wrist break was such that it was not an injury. The doctors didn't treat it or didn't look at it as a basketball injury. It was the type of injury that you would see more in a car crash. And Ewing, to his great credit, at 35 years of age, actually comes back to play in the playoffs in the second round against Miami. The Knicks beat who do they beat in the first round? I think it might even
beat Miami in the first round.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. You're right. They beat. Okay. I'm sorry. So it's the second round where Ewing comes back to play against the Pacers. And we'll talk about the Miami series briefly in a minute here too. But Ewing, after the Knicks beat Miami, sort of valiantly wills himself back to come play in the 98 series, thinking that maybe he can sort of propel his team to a finals or to a title. Not meant to be, but this is sort of considered one of the great what if seasons of the 90s Knicks, because again, did they get past the Bulls? Probably not, but they were so good that they were being picked to win the finals, and then they end up not having anywhere near the season that anybody thought they were going to have.
So they end up the 7 seed. They play Miami in the first round. This is actually the second of 4 straight years where they'll play Miami, and the first of 3 straight victories for the Knicks. They're, a heavy, from a seeding standpoint, they're the 7 seed. The Heat are the 2 seed. And the Knicks end up, after they drop game 1, they win game 2 in Miami, 96-86. Game 3, back at the Garden, they lose 91-85. And then they come up with wins in game 4, and then a big 17-point win in game 5 to take a pretty significant upset over the Heat and get a little revenge from the year before.
And this is also the second straight year where there's a fight and there are suspensions. This one is between Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning, who had been teammates of the teammates and didn't like each other particularly much during their years with the Charlotte Hornets. So they get in a fight. Mourning ends up being suspended for Game 5, I believe. And there's the famous picture of Jeff Van Gundy pulling on Alonzo Mourning's leg and sort of kind of embarrassing himself. Here's this little guy tugging on the leg of this big Alonzo Mourning. And yeah, Mourning is suspended. Mourning does not play in Game 5. And in fact, in Game 4, when Mourning is coming off the court, Riley says to him, Pat Riley, the Heat coach, says to him, "You just blew the season." However, prior to Game 5, and this is all from Paul Knepper's great book, The Knicks of the 90s, which he might have been the first ever author guest on Hello Old Sports. We interviewed him way back in the January, February of 2021 time period about his book on the Knicks of the 90s. Yeah. One of the first authors that we interviewed. And Riley says, "The only thing I'm disappointed in is that Zoe didn't connect when he tried to punch Larry Johnson in the face. I would have punched him too if he went after my injured face." Mourning had fractured his cheekbone in March and was playing without his protective mask for the first time in a couple of months. So yeah, so this has sort of been a brewing thing, not only between Mourning and Johnson, but also between the Knicks and the Heat. And unlike the previous year where the Knicks had been the ones who really got hurt by the suspension in the deciding game or deciding games because of a fight, this year it's Mourning getting suspended. Knicks win Game 5, head to the finals or head to the next round of the playoffs. They end up losing to the Pacers in the second round, but the Knicks Heat rivalry continues to heat up in the 1998 playoffs.
So just to zoom ahead a little bit, just because knowing what we have to get to still left in the NBA and then everything else, it's interesting looking at this. Not a ton of competitive series in any of the playoffs in the first round. There's 2 5-game series, both in the West. Utah over Houston, Seattle over Minnesota, both the 1 and 2 seed, but they both advance. The second round, every series is a 5-game series. Chicago over Charlotte 4-1, Indiana over the Knicks 4-1, Utah over San Antonio 4-1, Lakers over Seattle 4-1. And then the Western Conference Finals was Utah against the Lakers, who we talked about, and Utah sweeps them. So I know you want to talk about the Eastern Conference Finals, but I just figured I'd get through the rest of that.
So real quick on the Western Conference Finals, this is the final straw for Nick Van Exel with the LA Lakers. It's becoming more of a Shaq and Kobe team, but Del Harris, despite his great knowledge of modern technology, is not really connecting with Van Exel. And prior to Game 4, as the team is leaving practice, Van Exel leads the team in a cheer and says 1, 2, 3 Cancun, meaning one more loss and we get to all go to Cancun and enjoy our off season. That's the last straw for Van Exel with the Lakers. So yeah, better days are to come for the Lakers in the Phil years, but in this particular year, you're right. They do get swept 4-0. This Pacer team, like you said, it's Larry Bird's first year as the head coach of the Indiana Pacers. And this is a deep team that the Pacers have. Obviously led by Reggie Miller, but Rick Smits, and I believe this might be Smits' all-star year. This is Rick Smits' only all-star year. So they got Miller, they got Smits, they got veteran guys, they got Mark Jackson, who will remain with them for another few years, is kind of the catalyst, the floor general at point guard. Chris Mullen joins the team. They got the Davis brothers. Jalen Rose is a young star sort of coming into his own. Derek McKee, who's been with the team for a while. So this is sort of a growing, very deep Pacer team that would make it to the conference finals again the following year in 99, lose to the Knicks, and then in 2000 make it all the way to the NBA finals. against the aforementioned Los Angeles Lakers. The Pacers are one of only two teams in the Jordan years. Once they start winning, this is 91 forward. They're one of only two teams to take the Jordan Bulls to a 7-game series. The first is the Knicks in 92 in the I guess that would be in the second round in 92. Yeah, that's the year that the Knicks have Xavier McDaniel and take him all the way to 7 games after winning game 1 in Chicago. And then the second team is this Pacer team that takes the Bulls to 7 games. They lose the first 2 games in Chicago, and then they win game 3 on a last minute 3-pointer by I'm sorry, that's game 4. They win game 3 107-105, so a 2-point win. And then the following game in game 4, Miller hits a buzzer beating 3 to win game 4 for the Pacers. They go back to Chicago. They get blown out 106-87. But then back in Indiana, they managed to pull out another win 92-89. And they go to game 7. They're in Chicago and they hang with them. Final score of the game is 88-83, but at one point in the fourth quarter, it's 77-74 Indy. And so the Bulls, and also keep in mind, in game 7 in 92 against the Knicks, the Bulls had blown the Knicks out in that game 7. So this was the first time in a game 7 that they were really in danger of losing. Now they rally and they end up pulling it out 88-83, but as late as the fourth quarter of the 98 Eastern Conference Finals game 7, there's a real chance that the Bulls are not going to the NBA Finals.
So they hold on, they win. They go to the finals, and it's sort of an interesting thing because it's the first time in this Bulls run that they're playing the same team. I guess technically, even if they had played the Lakers, it would have been the same franchise as they beat in their first finals because they beat the Lakers in 91, but they beat the Lakers in 91. They beat the Blazers in 92. They beat the Suns in 93. Couple of year hiatus. Then 96 is the Sonics. 97 is the Jazz. And they go into 98, and it's the same Utah Jazz team. Now, whether this is I don't think that the 97 Jazz by most metrics were a better team. They were 64-18 instead of 62-20. They were I believe Malone was the MVP in 97. In 98 it was Jordan again. But in some ways this felt like a team that was better prepared to beat the Bulls. Firstly, it was a team that had been there. To be honest, at this point, the teams in the Eastern Conference, and I know, they got close in game 7 or whatever, but the Bulls' aura was so dominant over those teams in the Eastern Conference that I have a hard time believing any of them down the stretch in a game like that would have lost to the Bulls or would have beaten the Bulls with, the chips on the line because the Bulls had tormented them for so many years. But Utah's a team with relatively little history with them. I don't know. It felt like possibly, Utah with 2 Hall of Famers of their own. I don't know. It felt like, at least going in, there was a chance that this Utah team might have been drawn up, to have a good shot.
Well, and they had played them tight the year before. And the year before, the 97 finals was tied at 2. If I'm remembering correctly.
I believe so. Yeah.
This year it's not. This year it's 3-1, and then the Jazz win game 5 to force a game 6 back in Utah.
Yeah, so 97 real quick. The Bulls win the first 2 games at home. But they in 97 they win by 2, and 12 is a big win. They win by 12 in game 2. Then the Jazz win game 3 and game 4. Game 4 is 78-73. Game 5 in Utah, the Bulls win by 2, and then they go back to Chicago, but only win by 4. So they did have a tougher time than it would indicate. I'm talking about going in. Was this the first time they wouldn't have had home court in the NBA Finals?
It's just the first time they wouldn't have had home court.
Definitely
They didn't have it against Phoenix.
Oh, in 93 they didn't?
Yeah,
oh, that's right.
Because they were all, incidentally, there's not a lot to criticize those Bulls teams for, but they were not always the best at closing series out in the finals. They were down 3-0 to Seattle. Let Seattle win 2 and get back in them before they closed in game 6. They were up 3-1. They were up 2-0 and 3-1 on Phoenix, and then lost game 5 to the Suns in Chicago to make it a 3-2 series and have to go back to Phoenix to close it out in game 6. And then even in this series in 98, they're up 3-1 and then lose to Utah rather in game 5, 83-81. So yeah, they're not necessarily the best at closing out these finals. I almost wonder if it got to the point where they were just like even subconsciously just toying with these teams, knowing that eventually they would be able to put them away. But the only other thing I think there's we should talk a little bit about game 6, but there is one other interesting game in this NBA finals. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
This would be the game where didn't the Bulls like destroy them in one game?
They destroyed them. They won by 42, which is not necessarily the biggest thing. It's the fact that the Bulls 96 and Utah 54, which I believe is the lowest amount of points for a team, even including the pre-shot clock era, which I think, when did the shot clock era end? Like 54, 55, I think was the institution of the shot clock. So that is a really bad loss. And the fact that the Jazz were able to recover and win a couple more games in the series is testament to the fact that they weren't just lying down. But yeah, a game 3 blowout loss, 96 to, I guess they only win one more game in the series, but still 96-54. That is just a pathetic showing. Game 6 is a close game. It's a back and forth game. It's tied at 83 with a minute left. Jordan has just hit 2 free throws to tie the game. And then John Stockton makes a 3-point shot to put the Jazz up 86-83. Come down, Jordan hits a layup. It's 86-85. And then with 18 seconds left, Jordan steals the ball from Karl Malone. Bulls come down on the other side. Jordan hits the famous shot over Brian Russell, and there's that famous picture of him sort of leaving his hand up in the air on the follow through of his shot. A lot of people always say that they think that Jordan pushed off of Brian Russell when he was dribbling the ball. And the Jazz don't score on sort of a last ditch effort to shoot a 3-pointer. And Michael Jordan kind of goes off into the sunset. At the time, everybody thought forever. Obviously he's got his Wizards years that come after that, but a storybook end to a storybook dynasty with Jordan as the greatest player of all time, doing it on both ends of the floor, getting the steal and then coming down and hitting the shot to win the series for the Bulls.
Yeah, an iconic moment. Obviously, as a kid, I really, those couple of years, I really did like those Utah teams. So in addition to Jordan sort of tormenting me as a young Knicks fan, he also did it to me with these couple of Utah teams that I really liked. I'll strip any sort of humor out of it. He obviously did push off. Brian Russell is playing defense in a way that, by the time the camera cuts to Jordan, Brian Russell is on ice skates forward. He obviously pushed off. You're also obviously not getting that call in that situation, especially with Michael Jordan. As much as I would like to sit here and say, it's tainted because he pushed off, you were never going to see that play called. And it wasn't, he would have had to have basically grabbed him by the shirt and thrown him on the ground for there to be a foul called in that situation. Mm-hmm. So, the rare, although we really do get 2 of them in this year, the rare end to a superstar's career that, and obviously Michael Jordan, there's no bigger superstar ever than Michael Jordan in any sport. The fitting end, to the career that ends on, and again, obviously he can't resist and goes back to the Wizards, but in that moment, remarkably, improbably, Michael Jordan's career is going to get an ending that lives up to the rest of his career.
And he hadn't been the guy who hit the big shots for the previous championship. Paxson in 93, Kerr the year before in 97. So it was something unique and very fitting that he did it for himself in that 98 NBA Finals. Do you want to talk a little bit real quick about the college basketball season? I don't really think
no, we got a couple of things we got to get to with the NBA still. So real quick, the draft number 1 pick is Michael Olowokandi. Obviously does not work out. There are some great players, Hall of Famers picked in this draft. They're just picked a little later. Vince Carter goes number 5 overall. Number 9, Dirk Nowitzki. Number 10, Paul Pierce. Obviously guys who are Hall of Famers. So that's the draft. But then while it's more associated with the following season, just a couple weeks after the NBA Finals are over, the NBA owners lock the players out. Mm-hmm. And, again, because we got other stuff to get to, we'll just do this quickly, but it's essentially the owners wanting a hard cap, a ceiling on contracts. They want an elimination of, the bird rule where teams could, if it was a guy under contract with you already, you could sign him for more money. Long and short, the owners ultimately get a lot of what they want as the season. They don't get a hard cap. They don't get an NFL style cap, but at the time, at least, it's seen as a win for the owners. It says owners also sought to prevent large contracts for young players, similar to the 126 million 6-year deal that Minnesota star Kevin Garnett had just gotten. So they want like a rookie wage scale kind of thing. Again, they would have to almost do a whole episode on it. But I've always thought this lockout was sort of a fitting end to, not even fitting, but sort of a clear end to the 80s, 90s basketball sort of boom, which was an uninterrupted run from Jordan or from Magic and Bird to Jordan. And obviously there's tons of other players in there, but Jordan hits that shot. Jordan basically exits the stage. They go into a lockout, and seemingly when they come back, and I know this isn't fully accurate, but seemingly when they come back, the league is run by a new generation of players. The Rasheed Wallaces and the Allen Iversons and that sort of thing. And I think it was a turning point in the league.
And the biggest story in the NBA in a lot of ways in 99 is the Knicks. And they're led by Sprewell, who had choked his coach a year previous. And some of the players, they say some things during the lockout that I think it was a Kenny Anderson who was saying that he might have to sell one of his 10 cars or something. They don't acquit themselves well during the lockout. I mean, even Ewing, who is the leader of the players union, kind of does some things that are definitely sort of maybe missteps, and they don't do too well in the court of public opinion. And you're right. Even though Jordan does eventually come back, it's a very definite end of an era, beginning of the next era. No question about it.
You want to talk about college football or college basketball real quick, you said?
Yeah, there's not a lot to talk about. I feel like, at least not, nothing memorable really popped out at me. It's Kentucky. It's Tubby Smith in his rookie year. You talked about Pitino going to the Celtics. Tubby Smith takes over and leads Kentucky to, I believe it's their 7th NCAA title. I just had it up, but yeah, 7th national championship for Kentucky. They defeat the
Utah,
Lute Olson's Utah team in the NCAA championship.
Lute Olson was the coach at Arizona.
I'm sorry, not Lute Olson. Rick Majerus, not Lute Olson. Rick Majerus's Utah team. I mixed up the Utes. Yeah, and nothing really. Again, I'm sure if somebody who's a real expert on college basketball could point to some memorable moments, nothing really comes to mind for me. They did they did only beat Stanford in the 1997-98 NCAA, the Final Four, the Final Four round. And this was a team, this Stanford team was led, among others, by the Collins brothers, who were both freshmen on the team. And that's Jason and Jaron Collins, the brothers who both ended up playing center in the NBA. Jason Collins, best known as being the first openly gay player in the NBA. I remember Jason Collins even more so than that for his early years with the Nets when they were in New Jersey and his guarding of Shaq in the NBA Finals. And even though he didn't do a great job, he probably did better than anybody else the Nets threw at Shaq in those 2002 NBA Finals. So, and that really sort of jumped out for me because I don't think Stanford, they've done very little in the NCAA tournament for the last, 70 some odd years. A couple of years later, they made it to the Elite Eight, but this is their only Final Four appearance. Really, I mean, ever, I guess, they won it in 41-42. They won the NCAA title, but it didn't necessarily mean then what it means now. And if this season by season summary is to be believed, they don't even really make it back to postseason play for about another 40 years or so. So a sort of a rare bright spot in NCAA tournament basketball for the Stanford Cardinal. But
and as we stand here now, in July of 2023, their conference is collapsing from underneath them. Mm-hmm. I had forgotten I remembered Utah made a final in like 96 with Van Horn or whatever it was. I had totally forgotten that they made this final a couple of years later too. Mm-hmm. So do you want to go to hockey next, or did you have something else you wanted to get to?
No, nothing else with college hoops. Hockey, for my fellow DC area residents, this is one of only 2 Stanley Cup final appearances for the Washington Capitals. They don't manage to win any games in the finals. They're swept by Scotty Bowman's Detroit Red Wings team. Bowman ties Toe Blake, who had been one of the great coaches of the Montreal Canadiens. He ties Toe Blake with eight Stanley Cup titles. He breaks that record a few years later. I think it's in 2003 when the Red Wings win the Stanley Cup over the Devils in 2003.
I think it was 2002 because I feel like 2003 was the Devils over the Ducks. So
you might be right. You might be right about that. But nonetheless, this is the tie. This is the series which enables the great Scotty Bowman to tie the all-time record for Stanley Cup victories. And you were right. It was 2002. The Devils beat the Red Wings beat the Carolina Hurricanes in the NCAA in the Stanley Cup finals. And that's Bowman's 9th and I believe final championship to pull him ahead of Toe Blake for the all-time best. Nothing else. It's the last season for Fox Sports covering the NHL. We discussed that in a previous episode about Fox Sports in the 90s and all of the new things that they were doing. The Stanley Cup finals go to ABC, ESPN, where they remain for a while before they end up going
until the lockout.
Until the lockout, then they end up on NBC, and now they're back on. They're with Turner now, and then who's their
Turner and ESPN.
So they're back with ESPN, ABC now, at least part way. So go ahead. I'm sorry, I had one more hockey thing, but you go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead with the hockey thing.
Dominik Hasek wins back-to-back MVPs for the Buffalo Sabres. This is one of 2 back-to-back MVPs that he wins in the late 90s. He is one of the few goalies ever to win the Most Valuable Player award in the NHL, and he is the only goalie ever to win MVP twice.
Oh, interesting. So the playoffs, it was actually the 4th straight year that the finals were a sweep. 97, it had been the Red Wings the year before, too. They had swept the Flyers in that year, and they swept Washington in this year. No series in the playoffs went to a deciding game. There were some 6-game series, lots of 5-game series, no game 7s in the NHL playoffs. We're in the middle of this Red Wings sort of era of dominance, Steve Yzerman, Sergei Fedorov, all of that. A couple of sort of other things that I thought were interesting, the NHL, they're still very much in the middle of their Sun Belt expansion. At the start of the year, the league approved 4 additional franchises who would start playing by the 2000 season. It was expansion franchises in Nashville, Atlanta, Columbus, and St. Paul. The Atlanta team has since relocated to Winnipeg and become the Jets again. There's a Jets again. Columbus, St. Paul, Nashville, all still there. And even the St. Paul is kind of a part of the Sun Belt expansion because the original Minnesota hockey team, the North Stars, moved to Dallas about 5 years before this, and then Minnesota got a team back. So 3 of those 4 teams still exist as they do. It was also in a moment of,
but none of them did any of them play in the 97-98 season, or was
no, but they announced.
Gotcha.
The 97-98 season was also the first year in a moment of great personal sorrow for me and my fellow longtime Connecticut residents. This was the first season of the Carolina Hurricanes, who were previously the Hartford Whalers. So the Hurricanes continued a southern march from a lot of NHL teams. This was just firmly in the era of the NHL expanding, down south, southeastern. And to be honest, most of those franchises have been successful. Obviously, Atlanta wasn't. Atlanta had to move to Winnipeg and Phoenix, which is obviously out west, but they've been pretty much a long-term failure. But hockey is hugely popular in Nashville. The Predators draw all over the place. The Lightning have won 2 cups recently. They've won 3 cups total. They do very well. The Florida Panthers, have dealt with runs of apathy, but it's been more successful than it hasn't been. Carolina's won a couple of cups. So just a few other sort of, again, trivia, whatever you want to call it. The Blackhawks missed the playoffs. It was the first time since 1969 that the Blackhawks had missed the playoffs. I believe began a run of them missing the playoffs most years after this for a little while.
Can I just interrupt you here on this?
Go ahead.
Because I was reading a book. It was actually a Bob Ryan book, so it was about Boston sports. But he kind of mentioned this tangentially, and the book was written in the mid '90s. Do you know that up until sometime? Do you know what I'm getting at here about the Blackhawks?
They weren't on TV in Chicago.
Their home games weren't on TV in Chicago until 10 years ago.
Well, it was a little longer than that now, but the reason I knew that is so the Blackhawks had their mini dynasty in starting in, I guess, 2010. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because 2011, because they won 3 cups in, I want to say, 6 years, and they won the cup in Boston. I should have been there. I would have been there, except I was back at work already.
He's quoting CM Punk.
Well, you can cut that out. Cut that part out. I remember reading when they won their first cup in 2011, or the first cup in a long time, reading an article talking about every time a team wins a championship, the local articles are about the fans have had to go through so much and that kind of thing. But it said something about how the owner was just still sticking to this mindset from the 40s that if we put the games on television, the fans won't go. So they literally, I think it was objectively sometime in the 90s, might have been a little bit later, but it actually might have been in the 2000s.
I think it was in the 2000s.
You couldn't watch Blackhawk home games on television.
Jeez.
Which is something that the rest of the world realized was a bad idea
30 years earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did know that. And this was obviously the start of their swoon in 69. 2 other things that I'll get into. This was the last year of the traditional division names, the Adams, the Patrick, the Norris, and the Smythe. Mm-hmm. I believe they had already reorganized them into basically conferences, like an Eastern Conference and a Western Conference, but they kept the division names for a few years. It used to be the Campbell and the Wales, and it was organized more like baseball and football are. And then the last thing, do you know what this was the first year that the NHL was without? I know that's worded.
I have a guess.
Okay.
Is this the first year that every player was wearing a helmet?
Yes. Craig McTavish had retired at the end of the 97 season. And he was the last player who was grandfathered in, who was in the league when the helmet rule went into place. So he was the last player without a helmet. So there was at least a game in that 1996. I don't know if the team he was on played a national TV game, but there was a chance there was a Fox NHL game with the blue laser light and a player playing without a helmet.
I actually remember watching a documentary a couple years ago on the 94 Rangers, and the 94 Rangers traded for Craig McTavish mid-season.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about how, there was like a contemporary news report, and it's like, the Rangers are bringing in one of the few players who doesn't wear a helmet anymore. Before we move on from hockey, I got to just really kind of give a quick overview of men's college hockey. The national champions that year were the Michigan Wolverines, who beat the Boston College Eagles 3-2 in overtime in the final game of the men's.
Your future alma mater.
Incorrect. My alma mater is Boston University, and we once did an episode on their hockey team. BU, however, was the number one seed in the Eastern region, or the Eastern bracket, whatever you want to call it. They lost in the second round to New Hampshire 4-3. Although their star player, Chris Drury, future New York Ranger Chris Drury, did win the Hobey Baker Award as the best player in college hockey. Drury, who is the president and general manager of the New York Rangers to this day. So that's a little snapshot of college hockey for you as well. And
while we're on the, before we leave the winter sports, I had written a note I meant to bring up when we talked about college basketball. The women's college basketball that year, Tennessee won their third straight title under Pat Summitt. Mm-hmm. This was, I believe, their sixth championship overall. This was sort of in the run of, it was still mostly Tennessee. UConn was just on the door, starting to really challenge and ultimately take them over for that top spot in, all of college basketball. This Tennessee team went 39-0. It's considered one of their best teams ever. One of the best teams in women's college basketball ever. In the NCAA tournament, they won. I guess they were challenged a little bit in the Elite Eight against North Carolina, but they won the national semifinal, the Final Four. They won by 28 points. They won the national championship by 18. They won their Sweet 16 game by 32. Just an all-around dominant Tennessee Lady Vols team that year.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to baseball. And this is obviously one of the most talked about, written about, remembered, you name it, baseball seasons of all time. And that's the 1998 baseball season, and specifically the McGwire-Sosa home run chase, where they both obliterate Roger Maris's long-standing single-season record. McGwire ends up with 70, actually hits his 62nd against the Cubs, with Sosa playing the outfield off of Steve Traxel. And then Sosa ends up with an equally, or not equally, but an almost as impressive 66. Now, obviously, the steroid allegations, or probably more than allegations, the steroid revelations against both men have definitely put a damper on that memory. But at the time, it was one of the most exciting sports stories of a generation.
Yeah, let's talk about this and then talk about the rest of the baseball season instead of trying to weave it through. We come to it, and I mean we meaning me and you, probably come to this from one of the most thin slices of this situation imaginable, at least me, which is, I was, again, 1998, I was in 7th grade, going into 8th grade sixth grade going into 7th grade. So the first half of 1998, I would have been in 6th grade. The second half would have been in 7th. So you would have been in 9th and then 10th. I didn't really know anything about steroids. The only thing, to be honest, what I knew about steroids back then was that wrestlers got in trouble for taking them, but that they all were on steroids. That was like my general understanding of steroids, was that they made you strong. I remember this happening, and as a Yankee fan And as a person who even then, as much as a 12-year-old is capable of being like a sports history person, not wanting Mark McGwire to break the record, having nothing to do with steroids, having everything to do with the fact that it was a Yankee record set in 1961. I doubt many people, who were my generation cared about that. You have to be a Yankee fan so that's what I mean. I came from this from such a skewed perspective of my feelings of it at the time.
I think it was also the fact, and I didn't, at 14 or 15, whatever I was, didn't suspect that it was about steroids either. But I think it might have also been the fact that they were just obliterating it. It wasn't a home run chase. And I don't know if I conceptualized steroids, but something about it seemed wrong. Like, this is too easy for these guys. Now, look, maybe some people said the same thing 30 some odd years before about Maris with expansion and more games and all that stuff. But it just felt, and I don't know if I thought it was more about the ballparks or the ball or, expansion, thinning the pitching ranks, but it just, something about it just felt like these guys were just obliterating a record that it shouldn't have been quite so easy for them to obliterate. So that was, I remember, sort of my, even if not entirely articulated, thought about the whole thing.
Yeah. And weren't there a few other guys chasing it at various points in the season too? Was Griffey involved for a little while, and Greg Vaughn, I want to say?
I don't know if Greg Vaughn was that his really good year? I think Greg Vaughn hit 50 that year because
maybe it was a different year.
No, I think it was that year because he was on the Padres team that ended up facing the Yankees in the World Series. And the Yankees had almost traded for Greg Vaughn the year before. Yeah, 50 home runs for Greg Vaughn. So there's a really good article on ESPN that came out a few years ago, right about the time when that 30 for 30 aired, about that. It was called Long Gone Summer. So at the end of April 30th, Sammy Sosa has 6. 3 guys have 11. McGwire, Griffey, and Vinny Castilla, who is playing in the Coors Field, one of the first years of Coors Field for the Colorado Rockies. At the end of May, this is interesting. McGwire has 27. Sosa has 13. So after 2 months, McGwire's got Sosa doubled. Also at the end of May, A-Rod has 20. Griffey has 19. And then 2 Colorado Rockies, Vinny Castilla and Andres Galarraga, both have 19. Sosa has a
June, yeah.
Sosa has a monster June. In June, McGwire hits 10, which isn't bad. He gets to 37. Griffey hits 14. He gets to 33. Sosa hits 20. So he hits twice as many as McGwire. So by the end of June, McGwire 37, Sosa 33, Griffey 33. And then as the summer goes on, Griffey kind of trails off a little bit and it becomes a 2-person race. But even into the summer, it was not a 2-person thing. Griffey was very much a part of it. And I remember seeing those graphics on ESPN when they do them in SportsCenter in the mornings with the paces and everything. It was all 3 of them well into the summer.
And Griffey ended up hitting 56 home runs, which any other year would have been like, wow, he really shook the hell out of that record. Yeah, I'm looking at a stretch here in June, a few days against the Phillies. It looks like he hit 5 home runs in a 2-game stretch against the Phillies, or at least a 2-day stretch.
Sosa?
I don't know if there was a doubleheader in there, but good Lord.
And just real quick, at the end of July, it's McGwire 45, Sosa 42, Griffey 41. That's where it's, and then August is kind of a separation. At the end of August, they're both at 55, and Griffey's only at 47. So obviously, it's a 2-person race by that point. But for most of the summer, Griffey's right there with them.
And you mentioned at the end of September, they're both at 55. On September 1st and September 2nd, McGwire hits 2 home runs each of those days, from what I can see. And I guess by the time they were both at 55 with a month left of the season, it was pretty much, I don't know if it's a foregone conclusion then, because, you could have a horrible month. But by September 2nd, when he's got 59 home runs, it's a foregone conclusion that unless McGwire gets hurt, he's going to find a way to hit 3 more home runs this season. And then September 4th, he ties Babe. Or wait, that was September 4th. Might have been. On September 5th, McGwire hits number 60 against the Reds, which ties him with Ruth and brings him to within 1 of the record. At the time, Sosa's up at 58. So, it's obviously going to happen at that point. I guess there's a chance they both theoretically could have hit 61 or 62 on the same day in the same game when they were playing each other. Obviously, that doesn't happen. Before we talk about sort of the end of it, and this is another one where I remember it being a big deal. I remember it being a thing people were really into and talking about every day. I was perhaps too young and talking to people who were too young to make any sort of connection between this is bringing people back to the game who were still disillusioned by the 94 strike. I don't know how much of that is because you can obviously look at numbers, and through 95 and even 96, there were people who were pissed off, and there were some people who stayed away forever. So obviously this didn't bring them back. But part of me also just wonders, after a couple of years where they just kind of what am I going to do? Give up baseball forever?
Well, that's the hard thing, is it's a counterfactual, right? It's, like any number of things, whenever people say, you saw it even a little bit during COVID. And not that COVID didn't change a lot of things, but people thought that COVID had killed live sports or live concerts or whatever. And then, eventually things kind of regressed back to where they were. So I think you're exactly right. Who knows? The one thing I'll say is that I think it was the last time that I remember in my lifetime where baseball was really in sort of the consciousness of the everyday American. Ladies at church were talking about Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, that type of thing, to where it was part of what was going on in the world, the same way that the president is, or, a hit movie or that type of thing. It was sort of that other level of everybody was talking about it. Even people who weren't sports fans were picking their favorites, Sosa, McGwire. That part of it was unique, even if it didn't sort of bring people back to baseball, quote unquote. And from a sports point of view, rare has been the time over the last 30 years where individual baseball players have been the most marketable guys in sports. And McGwire and Sosa, McGwire especially, came really close during that year or two.
Yeah, and that's McGwire became a cultural phenomenon. McGwire being, he had been traded from the A's, 2 years earlier?
Year before, 97.
97. He was a big, sort of fair-haired white guy who, I don't remember where Mark McGwire's from. Is he from California?
Yeah, he's from California.
But he's playing for the Cardinals, sort of the Heartlands team, and, that sort of kind of looking like a muscular Chuck Norris. You know what I mean? He very much...
Son was the bat boy.
Yeah, he very much tapped into sort of the illusions or sort of fantasies we tell ourselves about baseball. It was almost like a modern day Roy Hobbs in a lot of ways, from The Natural, where he's this big strapping guy who's hitting home runs and smiling. And, I remember reading an article at the time or hearing something, because he was divorced, but hearing oh, well, he's got a great relationship with his ex-wife. And it was what the hell does that matter about anything? But you know what I mean? It was and
first of all, I do think he's a legitimately good guy. I think,
yeah.
And I actually have some sympathy for him with the steroid stuff because I think
I want to end with that stuff. But
I think he legitimately feels bad about what happened, even if he hasn't always been fully forthcoming. But he was great with the Maris family. And the other thing too is, fair or not, the other guy had sort of a limited command of the English language, not as limited as it would be when he went to testify in front of Congress 5 or 6 years later. But and Sosa gave interviews and he spoke and everything. It wasn't. I want to minimize that, but McGwire was so accessible to the press. He was so good at sort of seeming genuine, and like I said, with the Maris family and all that stuff. So. Yeah, and it was just the perfect. And here's the other thing, too, and I really do think this matters. Jordan's gone. June of 98, Jordan's going. They're looking for the next best thing. Let's be honest. Nike is looking for the next best thing, and that's when you get chicks dig the long ball and all that type of stuff. This was, in a lot of ways, let's look for the next big guy to market in sports, and it was kind of a perfect storm.
Yep, and I'm sure there was a McDonald's thing at some point with Big Mac because that was what they called them, or maybe they called them that after the sponsorship. But it was really, he was very much out of central casting for this kind of thing. People kind of, it was almost like he'd never been anywhere else, even though he'd been on the A's and been on good teams and been in what probably should have been a tell at the time, been the Bash Brothers with Jose Canseco. So I just kind of want to talk about the doing of it, the subsequent ending of it. And then, it's one of those things. And then we'll talk about the steroids for just a minute, because we've talked about it in the context of the Hall of Fame before. It's the kind of thing I'd have no interest in doing a whole show on because I think it's been done to death. This is the closest we're going to get to it. So I kind of want to, get to that. But so I mentioned he starts September. He gets to the 4 home runs. So he's got 59. Sosa's got 56. 2-game series against the Cubs. He hits on September 7th. He hits a ball off Mike Morgan of the Cubs to hit his 61st home run. The next day against the Cubs, nationally televised. He's got 61. The Maris family's there. It's his shortest home run of the season. It just scrapes the wall and gets over, doesn't it? From what I remember.
The 62nd, yeah. They said it was his shortest home run of the year.
Just 341 feet, just over the left field wall. He runs past first base. He almost as he's rounding the bases, he forgets to touch first base and he has to just take a step back and touch first base. Finishes rounding the bases. They pause the game momentarily, actually more than momentarily. Sosa runs in because they happen to be playing the Cubs. There's pictures of them hugging and I think doing a fake punch kind of thing that they did when they greeted each other. And, it's a storybook moment. It's pictures of him with, the Maris family. And after the game, he gives a speech about, the bat, and, it's immortalized at the beginning of 61. If you've seen that movie. So it really is a, fairy tale breaking of the record. The difference being then there's a month left in the season. Sosa actually ties him at 63 on September 16th. They're tied at 65 on September 23rd. They're tied at 66 on September 25th. And then in the last several days between September 26th and September 27th, McGwire has a huge series against the Expos and gets to the 70 number where Sosa stays at 66. And that's where they finish the season, each having demolished a record that hadn't been broken in 37 years.
And the interesting thing about it is, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit when we touch on the playoffs, but Sosa's actually on a halfway decent team. He actually makes it to the playoffs. McGwire's on a not so good Cardinal team. But why don't we finish off with this piece first?
And I remember that too, because I remember kind of going the last two guys who did it were on the 61 Yankees and the 27 Yankees.
Yeah.
But so they both break the record again the next year. They both break 62 again the next year. Bonds, what is it, 01 that Bonds hits the 73 or 02?
01.
So they both, I think by then Roger Maris was like 8th on the list or something like that in that 98 to 01, 02 period. You know, and it's interesting because around here locally, this came up a little more again last year when Aaron Judge hit the 62nd home run, and the Maris, I think it was Roger Maris Jr. made comments. And my thought on him specifically they're allowed to feel a little cheated. You know what I mean? Them specifically, if you're Roger Maris's family, I understand feeling like, you know, Mark McGwire kind of lied to you and took advantage of you and stuff like that. Beyond that, and I'm not saying anything new here, but, you know, there's obviously was a market correction, and anybody who's listened to any of these kind of knows my thoughts on it, that it was fine when it was McGwire and Sosa, and then suddenly it was Barry Bonds, who most people didn't like, and they decided we needed to do these things about these steroids.
Clemens, too, to a certain extent.
And then A-Rod. And like I said, those are the three. Those are the three that got the hammer dropped the most on them, and they just happened to be three unlikable guys. Now, that's on them for being unlikable. Bonds was unlikable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not anybody else's fault that people didn't like Barry Bonds, but anyway, the thing that stinks about the steroids from that point is that record is out of reach forever now. Like, because, you know, they've obviously cracked down on the drug testing. Can you think of the kind of year Aaron Judge had last year? Somebody needing to hit 12 more home runs than that to break that record.
That's
nobody's gonna touch that record. You know, so.
Well, I think that was sort of my point too, was like at the time, it didn't feel like it was being bested. It felt like it was just being obliterated.
Yeah. So baseball obviously used these guys. They were happy to either look the other way or, you know, whatever you want to say. And certainly baseball was hypocritical years later when they made it seem like these guys perpetrated the greatest crime in the history of the sport. Do I think these guys acquitted themselves well? And I'm talking in general, McGwire, Sosa, Bonds, Rafael Palmeiro, all these guys. Do I think they necessarily acquitted themselves well in the subsequent years? No, but I also see it from a standpoint of, you're a young baseball player. You're taking something that, you know, at various points was in a gray area of legality, both in the laws and in the rules of Major League Baseball. And then suddenly they're called in front of the United States Congress. Yeah, I'm not that surprised they lied, to be honest with you. You know what I mean? Like, I probably would have lied.
Yeah, once it got to that point, what else were they going to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, no, yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, I mean,
and Lance Armstrong was always a thing with me where that, like, obviously the Tour de France, because he tried to go after people for like libel and slander and ruin people's lives the whole time, knowing they were telling the truth and he was lying. I don't really see any evidence, and I don't even really see that much evidence these guys tried to hide it beyond just saying like, "Oh no, I don't do that," whatever. I guess you could say that's hiding it, but like, I 90% am kind of like, it was an era. It was a very contained thing. That's what happened in those years. And what I said with the Judge record was, when Judge is going for the 62 home runs, and some people were saying it's the American League record. And it's like, yeah, technically it's the American League record. It's the Yankee record. Okay. No, you can't say this is the real home run record. You don't get to do that. But you also can at least acknowledge, hey, every other guy who's hit more home runs than 62 did it between 1998 and 2001. They're all guys who are considered very credibly linked, or in some cases conclusively, to performance-enhancing drugs. And you're allowed to at least mention that. That's sort of where I come down on this.
Yeah, I think me too. I mean, you're allowed to feel it, right? You're allowed to say to yourself, when Aaron Judge hits number 62, you're allowed to say, you know, I'm glad he did it, because now somebody who has bested the 61 from Roger Maris is not a steroid guy. Yeah, I think
it's disingenuous to be like, oh, look at these people cheering on him hitting the 8th most home runs of all time. It's like, that's disingenuous and you know it.
Yeah, I agree. I think with the steroid thing, there's too many people who, I mean, there's plenty of people who just condemn it outright and don't want, and we've talked about how I think some of these guys should get in the Hall of Fame, but there's also almost like too much of a backlash where there's people who act like if you have any problem with it whatsoever, it's like, well, it's Babe Ruth drank beer, or it's like, okay, we get it. Like,
and that's where I agree with you in terms of, I'd almost like to look at it from a way of, yes, overall, this is a little bit of a dark period for the game. Let's not kill the 12 guys who were the most successful during that period, doing what was widely being done at the time. You know what I mean? They got the steroids from what we can tell, mostly out of baseball. That's a good thing. Let's not then turn around and say like, oh, and we also need to tar and feather these guys forever.
Agreed. All right, do we want to talk about a couple other things from baseball real quick?
I think there's a lot of other things to talk about in baseball, all of while this is going on. And I just realized this is a theme in this 3-year period, although this one's for much different reasons. All of while this is going on, the worst ever defense of a championship is taking place. But if you think about it, the Bulls and the Broncos the next 2 years are very similar, although the Broncos weren't as bad. But the Marlins, and I you probably weren't planning on starting here, but the Marlins, who had won the World Series the year before, kind of a lightning in the bottle thing, sell off their entire team going into 1998?
Either going into 1998 or shortly thereafter. They were sort of the ultimate one-team wonder after kind of catching lightning in a bottle. So they win the 97 World Series. Here it is immediately, November 11th. So basically a couple weeks afterwards. First thing, they trade Moises Alou to the Astros. A week later, they trade Rob Nen and Devon White. Then they trade Jeff Conine. And then, some smaller guys leave as free agents. Early February, they trade Al Leiter. And then once the season starts, they trade a bunch of guys, but most notably Bobby Bonilla, Charles Johnson, and Gary Sheffield, who had been 3 of the starting players. Now, Charles Johnson actually makes his way back to the Marlins a few years later, but sort of 3 of the starting lineup players of the team from the previous year. In that trade, they bring back Mike Piazza, but then they immediately turn him around a week and a half or so later for the Mets, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, and some of the other guys too that had been key players on the team. So like Edgar Renteria, who had the game-winning hit, right, of that World Series.
Yes,
Renteria in 97. Yeah, I believe they just let him leave as a free agent. So it's not even just the fact that they're letting these, they start fire selling the team once the season starts. They're also letting guys walk as free agents before the season even starts. And this is another one of those where I have a memory of it even at the time, where just right away they just kind of started dismantling this team. Yeah, Johnson, Conine, Bonilla, Alou, White, Sheffield, 6 guys there from the starting lineup that I just mentioned, all of whom they traded away. They let they actually keep Renteria for the whole 98 season. He's the one guy they keep around, and then he goes to St. Louis after the 98 season. So basically 6 of the 8 guys from their starting lineup, plus Al Leiter, who we mentioned, plus Rob Nen, who'd been their closer. They must, I think it was Kevin Brown. Was he part of the, Brown leaves as a free agent. He goes to the San Diego Padres and makes it to a second straight World Series. So yeah, they either through free agency or trades, basically entirely dismantle the entire team after like 4 months. And I think I remember reading something even at the time where it was like, it's getting embarrassing for them to every game announce the defending champion Florida Marlins. It was like, we got to not do this anymore, guys. This is clearly.
Yeah. Which one of those words is least applicable? Champion or defending? They finished 54-108, which was actually brings me to my next point. They finished with the worst record in Florida that year, 9 games worse than the expansion and also very terrible Tampa Bay Devil Rays. This was the first year of a 30-team Major League Baseball. The Tampa Bay Devil Rays and the Arizona Diamondbacks join the league. It's the first expansion since '93 when the Marlins and Rockies came into the league. As part of balancing the leagues, because they did add Tampa Bay, they shift the Milwaukee Brewers from the National League from the American League to the National League. I believe they offered it to Kansas City first, and Kansas City turned it down. And Milwaukee switches to the NL. So I think probably to get rivalries with the Cubs and the Cardinals out of it, where they remain to this day in the National League. So for the next 15 years or so, we had 16 teams in the National League and 14 teams in the American League until they decided to just make interleague play a more regular occurrence instead of just 1 month out of the year, and shifted the Astros to the AL. But that was sort of the structural changes in the league at this point.
And the Diamondbacks are decent pretty early on. They're in the playoffs under Buck Showalter by their second year, by 99, and then they're winning a championship by the following year. So they're actually only 2 games better than the Rays, the Devil Rays in 98. Rays win 63 games, Diamondbacks win 65, but the Diamondbacks improved by 35 games from 98 to 99 and end up winning the NL West and losing to the Mets in the first round of the playoffs in 99. Devil Rays in 98, a couple of future Hall of Famers. They got a 40-year-old Wade Boggs who hits 280 in 123 games. And the following year, he actually gets his 3,000th hit, a home run for the Devil Rays in 99. And then they also have Fred McGriff, who plays 151 games at first base. So some talent, aging talent, though it may be, for the Diamondbacks, for the Devil Rays. But unlike the D-backs, who become a powerhouse pretty quickly, the Devil Rays will basically languish for an entire decade before they finally snip the postseason in 2008.
And then one additional thing I wanted to get to before we move on. This was when Cal Ripken's streak ended, I believe, in September of 98. And I remember watching this game live, actually. We were watching, and for reasons we'll probably explain in a few minutes, it was fun to make a point to watch them every night. But they were playing the Yankees at Camden Yards, and the game comes on, and I'm sure they talked about it on the pregame, and we just weren't watching it on the pregame, but we turned the game on MSG, I'm guessing. Mm-hmm. And they were like, big news as we come on the air at 7:00, and they showed Cal Ripken out, or who was the manager of the Orioles in 98?
I think it was still Davey Johnson, wasn't it?
So let's say it was Davey Johnson. They show him and Torrey exchanging lineups, and Johnson, they kind of stand there for a few more moments. And the reason was that for the first time in, 16 years or whatever it was, Cal Ripken was not in the starting lineup, made the decision to end his streak that day.
And it was not Davey Johnson. Davey Johnson, this is typical Davey Johnson, takes the team to 2 straight ALCSs in his 2 years as manager, 96 and 97, then promptly wears out his welcome and is gone by 98. We did a lot of 90s Orioles stuff with Andrew's friend Mike about 2 years ago. So check those out on some episodes on the Orioles of the 90s. But I wonder if Ripken was kind of ready for the streak to end, because for the first time in a few years, the Orioles were not a contender, not a playoff team. Apparently, he originally had wanted to end it on the road in their last series of the season at Fenway Park, and somebody talked him into it. They said, no, you got to end this at home. You got to end this in Baltimore. So that is what he ends up doing. He sticks around for a few more years, but is the streak is no more. What, 26-32, I think is the final number, I want to say.
Sounds right. Yeah. So that happens. We're obviously going to talk a little about the Yankees before the playoffs. Was there anything else you wanted to touch on before that?
Couple more quick things. This is the first year that the Cubs do not have Harry Carey as their broadcaster. He passes away just prior to the 1998 season. Another Cubs note, in May, a rookie, Kerry Wood, I believe he's a rookie, strikes out 20 players in a game, and he becomes sort of the phenom pitcher of 1998. Actually ends up, and 98 is his rookie year, actually ends up missing the entire 99 season, and then comes back and pitches several years with the Cubs and then bounces around the majors a little bit, including a stint with the Yankees. But he was a phenom, rookie of the year in 98. He was a real phenom in 98, and he was never really the same pitcher. He was sort of, everybody thought he was a young Clemens, and he has a decent career. He doesn't have a, he's not a bust by any means, but he's not nearly what anybody thought he would be when he was having this crazy rookie season in 1998. Couple of trades. This is when Mike Piazza comes to the Mets. The Dodgers trade him to the Marlins as part of the aforementioned Marlins fire sale, but it's very much assumed that he's not going to last very long, and he doesn't. He's only there for about, I think, a week, 10 days to 2 weeks. Ends up being traded to the Mets and is the anchor of their playoff teams, those powerhouse Met teams that all the Met fans fall in love with, like to kind of give Met fans something to cheer about for the first time in over a decade. In 99, 2000, they make the World Series, go on a decent run after 9/11 in 2001. So Mike Piazza, who's best known for his years as the Met, traded from the Florida Marlins after 2 weeks with the team in the summer of 1998. Another trade, July 31st, the Mariners trade Randy Johnson to the Houston Astros, and Johnson would actually end up leaving them as a free agent after the 98 season and signing with the Diamondbacks, and then he ends up winning, 4 Cy Young Awards in a row. But it's the beginning of the selling off of that Mariner team that had made the playoffs in 95, got on that incredible run, beat the Yankees in that epic 5-game series, made the playoffs again in 97. They trade Johnson in 98. Griffey leaves at the end of the 99 season. A-Rod leaves as a free agent, signs with Texas at the end of the 2000 season. And they have that amazing year in 2001 with Ichiro, but it's sort of that whole Mariner team, especially that Johnson, Griffey, A-Rod nucleus, kind of falls apart before they get to realize their full potential. And the trade deadline transaction sending Randy Johnson to Houston is the beginning of the end for that group.
And did Houston end up doing anything special that year? I mean, they obviously made that move with him being, they won 102 games that year. Jeez, I didn't realize that. But then they lost in 4 to the Padres in the playoffs, which we'll talk about. But
yeah, Padres not the best team in the National League that year by any stretch of the imagination. I would also note that first of all, the Mets almost make the playoffs before sort of faltering down the stretch. The Giants and Cubs are both 89 and 73, and the Mets finished a game back in the wild card at 88 and 74. The Cubs defeat the Giants in a 1-game playoff for the wild card. Steve Traxel, same guy who had given up Mark McGwire's 60-second home run, goes 6 1/3 scoreless innings. Barry Bonds goes 0 for 4 in the playoff game, and the Cubs make it to the the 4th ever National League wild card. Atlanta Braves have one of their best regular seasons. This might actually be the best regular season in Braves history. They win 106 games, but lose to San Diego in the NLCS 4-2. And San Diego beats 2 teams with a combined 208 wins in their 2 rounds of the NL playoffs before they get smacked pretty good by the Yankees in the World Series.
And you know how I've learned it's interesting? They played the Yankees in the World Series in 96 and 99. I knew they were there a bunch in the early 90s. They won in 95. My friend Mike, who's a country music fan, sent me a song that some guy wrote and sang and whatever a few years ago. And it's called 98 Braves. And he's like talking about this girl, and he's saying like, it's like a girl where it was like he's like describing the Braves, and he's saying like, if you and I were like a team, would be the '98 Braves, where it was like everything was working great, and then it just like didn't come together. And it was just that's how I was like, why the '98 Braves? Like I would think like the '96 Braves, and that's how I looked it up. I'm like, oh, the '98 Braves won like 106 games. That's why he was bringing that up. But yeah, it's funny. Just within the last few months, that was put on my radar. So,
all right. So why don't we, given just how long this is going and how long we knew it would go, frankly. I don't know. I mean, the 98 playoffs, other than the fact we talked about the Braves losing, but do we really need to touch on anything big other than the Yankees as far as the 98 playoffs are concerned?
No, I mean, so you get in the first round, Cleveland beats Boston in 4 games. Boston gets the wild card. That's the other American League series. The NL, both first 2 rounds, kind of not that surprising. I guess the fact that San Diego wins is a minor upset, but San Diego won 98 games that year. They beat Houston. No 5-game series there. We talked about the NLCS. So yeah, the American League, I guess, is now where we go back and talk about the 98 Yankees, and then all the way through.
One thing I would just say is this Padre team's got a decent lineup. Ken Caminiti had been MVP a couple years previously, gets 29 home runs. Career year from Greg Vaughn that we mentioned with 50 home runs. Tony Gwynn is 38 years of age, so he's getting older, but he still hits 321, best on the team. They got a Hall of Fame closer in Trevor Hoffman, who has 53 saves, which I'd have to imagine I guess Rivera might have been close that year, but no, 53 saves for Hoffman is best in all of baseball. So Kevin Brown, 18-7. So they're a one-year wonder, although they'd been in the playoffs a couple times in the 90s. I know they were in there in 96, but they're still a good team, the 98 Padres. They're not going to be any match from the 98 Yankees. So.
And Hoffman, that 53 saves, by the way, is still tied for 6th all time. It looks like Right, K-Rod, Francisco Rodriguez still has the most with 62 in 2008, and then a few guys have 57, including Edwin Diaz 5 years ago. But so I guess we go back to the beginning with the 98 Yankees. This is the team. So they won in 96, and we've talked about the team they had that year being a little different. You can listen to our 96 Yankees episode. The 97 team was more in line with the 96 team in terms of the guys that were making up the core of the team.
They still had Boggs. They still had Cecil Fielder. They still had Mariano Duncan came back, although he got traded mid-season. They still had Strawberry was still expected to play a big role. They lost Wetland before 97, John Wetland, who'd been the closer. Jimmy Key left, but you're right. They were bringing back basically the same core, or not just core, but just basically the same team with a few exceptions in 97.
Yeah, so 98, they do some things in the off season. David Wells is brought in. It's almost like a trade between him and Jimmy Key, because Jimmy Key goes to Baltimore.
That was before the 97 season.
Oh, was it before 97?
Yeah, that was before 97. Wells was there in 97.
Okay, I just spilled my beer all over the place, so I'm distracted.
Do you need a minute, or?
Yeah, let me just get a paper towel and clean it up. Is you okay with that?
Yeah, of course. So we were talking about the
Yankees off season.
Yeah, the Yankees off season. So the 97 team was basically the same team. They actually are better in 97. I think 96, they win 92 games. And then in 97, they go up to 96 games, but it's the wild card to the aforementioned Baltimore Orioles. Losing 5 to Cleveland in the first round. Cleveland goes on to almost win a World Series against the Marlins in 97. And the Yankees going into 98 is when they really started to make some changes. The core is still there, but they let Boggs and Hayes walk at third base. They signed Scott Brocious. They bring in Chuck Knobloch, who'd been a star second baseman and a Gold Glover, believe it or not, despite his later offensive woes at second base. And, they start to shore up the bullpen. I mean, the bullpen's basically the same, I guess. Jeff Nelson had been there. Mike Stanton had come to the team in 97. But those couple of changes, Chili Davis is the other big one. Chad Curtis comes in from the year before. So some of the guys, not all, but some of the guys who had sort of been key players on that 96 team, Boggs, Hayes, Fielder, they don't know what they're going to get from Strawberry, although they end up getting a decent year from Strawberry in 98. It's sort of a different team in some slightly subtle ways. And that 98 team ends up being basically the same team with some changes and one big change that they carry through for the next 4 years when they make it to the World Series every year and win 3 of them.
And also in 98, Posada takes over, the balance of power shifts enough where Posada's really the starting catcher at this point, and Girardi's the backup. Now, Girardi still appears in plenty of games. He appears in 78 games. Posada appears in 111. So if you do the math on that, obviously, that's more than 162 games with subs and stuff. But, just Posada has 409 plate appearances. Girardi 279, just to give you a sense of the the split there. So that's sort of the changes from a lineup standpoint. From a pitching standpoint, the top 3 remain the same as it had in years past. Pettit, Wells, who had been there the year before, Cone. I think Ramiro Mendoza made a bunch of starts that year. It looks like he made, how many starts did he end up making that year? It says he made 14 starts, so he was in the rotation a good part of that year. But Hideki Arabu he had come up the year before, right, and been pretty
Correct.
good. And then this was his first full year.
This was his first full year, and he actually wasn't as bad as people might think it was. In fact, I think he was pitcher of the month in like June, maybe. On the season, he goes.
You know that for the same reason I know that, which is that we saw him on his first start in July, and he got his butt kicked.
Oh, that's right. That was that Philly game, right?
Yeah, but yes, he was like the American League pitcher of the month in June or whatever.
13-9, 4.06 ERA. He's clearly the number 4 starter. And then midway through the season, David Cone gets bit by his mother's little dog, and they have to bring up Orlando Hernandez to make a start. And Hernandez goes 12-4 with a 3.13 ERA. And so from then on, Arabu is clearly the 5 starter. But this is, this is not a bad year for Arabu. He gets bad the following year. 99 is when Hideki Arabu is not very good. He's 11-7. His ERA is 4.84. But by the end of the season, he's clearly, he's lost it. And then he kind of kicks around with the Expos for a couple years before, his life tragically ends a couple years, several years later. But Yankees start off 1-4 on a West Coast trip. Everybody thinks Torrey's in trouble. What's going to happen? But they right the ship. They end up with a 114-48 record. They win the American League East by 22 games over the wild card Boston Red Sox. David Cone has maybe his best season. He finishes with a 20-7 record. It is his best year might be 94 with Kansas City when he wins the Cy Young Award in an abbreviated season. But David Cone, 20-game winner, only 2 20-game win seasons in his entire career. The other was 10 years earlier with the Mets in 1988. His 20 wins leads all of Major League Baseball for the 1998 season. He finishes 4th in Cy Young voting. The Pettit goes 16-11. David Wells in his second year with the team, 18-4, and also pitches a perfect game against the Minnesota Twins in May of 1998. Nothing overly spectacular as far as the offense is concerned. Bernie Williams wins a batting title with 339 average. But other than that, it's just sort of solid but unspectacular. The only other two guys have triple-digit RBIs. Paul O'Neill, 116. Tino Martinez, who'd had a monster year before. He hit, 50 home runs in 97. Leads the team with 123 RBIs. Jeter, in his third year as a pro, hits 324. And I believe, I want to say 98 is Jeter's first All-Star game. Jeter finishes third in MVP voting. Juan Gonzalez is the MVP of the American League. Darryl Strawberry, at 36 years of age, plays in 101 games, 24 home runs, 4 Yankees hit over 20 home runs, but nobody hits over 30. Tino Martinez is in the lead with 28. It's just, in a season in baseball where so many guys, especially in the National League, but Griffey too, are putting up just astronomical offensive numbers, the best team in a generation and one of the best teams of all time is really kind of a pitching, defense. They hit. Nobody says they don't hit, but they're not a power hitting team. It is a very, very strange team to be such a dominant team in a season where big home run hitters were the theme.
And I think when you said they hit, that's the thing. Everybody hit. I'm looking at what was their sort of conglomerate, whatever the aggregate is the word I was looking for, starting lineup. And, the lowest guy in terms of batting average on the team, in that starting lineup, as it reloads on me here, if you want to say the left fielder would have been Chad Curtis, who I think probably hit towards the bottom of the lineup. He hit 243 and had a 360 or 355 on base percentage. And this was the team where walking was just, everybody walked a ton. There was not a guy of their top 10 who had less than 45 walks on the season. And you look at guys like Tino had 61, Knobloch 76, Jeter and Brocious both in the 50s. Chad Curtis walked 75 times at the bottom of the order. And they were not trying to walk Chad Curtis or pitch around Chad Curtis. The Yankees absolutely refused to swing at pitches out of the strike zone that year.
The other interesting thing about this team is, unlike in 96, where in 96 you kind of had more of a platoon. You had Hayes and Boggs at third. You had Fielder and Tino at first base, although Fielder obviously DH'd some as well. The lineup, other than in left field, it's pretty much the same thing. It's Posada and Girardi, I guess, but Tino, Knobloch, Jeter, Brocious, Bernie, O'Neill. They're basically throwing those 6 guys out, absent an injury. They're throwing those guys out there basically every game. Chili Davis is injured for much of the season, so Strawberry gets some at-bats at DH, as does Tim Raines. The left field is sort of this platoon. Chad Curtis is the main left fielder during the regular season, but then by the playoffs, they've got 2 rookies. They've got Ricky Leday, who starts a couple games in the World Series, I believe. Let me see Ricky Leday, because I think what does Leday do? He starts 3 games in the World Series, which is just crazy for a guy who was a rookie. And then they also have, he actually starts 3 games. Leday starts 3 of the 4 Yankee World Series games in left field over Curtis, over Raines, and over another guy in Shane Spencer, who was this September phenom who hits 10 home runs in 27 games. Another guy who never really lives up to his potential afterwards. He's sort of the offensive Kerry Wood of 1998. But there's just so many fun stories on this 98 Yankees team. The only sort of sad note is that just as the playoffs are getting started, Darryl Strawberry is diagnosed with, I believe it was colon cancer, right?
I believe it said that sounds right.
He diagnosed with colon cancer, goes into treatment, misses the whole postseason, and then there's other drug issues. He really only has like 2 months left in his career. He gets suspended for drugs again at the beginning of the 99 season, comes back, is with them for the stretch run in 99, and then has another drug issue, and then his career is essentially over. As far as the on the field in the postseason, not a ton of drama for this Yankee team. The closest that they come is ALCS against the aforementioned Cleveland Indians, where they win game 1, lose game 2, 4-1 in extra innings, lose game 3 to 6-1 behind a great pitching performance by Bartolo Colon for Cleveland, and end up on the road down 2-1 facing Doc Gooden, the former Yankee, as the starting pitcher for the Cleveland Indians. And their season is in trouble, but they get El Duque Hernandez in his first ever postseason appearance. They hadn't needed him in the first round against Texas because it had been a 3-game sweep. He pitches a 4-0 shutout, and then the Yankees win game 5, they win game 6, and then they go on and sweep the San Diego Padres. But they do a little bit have their backs against the wall in going into game 4. And then the other thing that happens is the famous the Chuck Knobloch play in game 2 of that series, where let me pull up the exact description, because I don't want to shortchange it.
And while you're going over that, just remember, in the context of 1998, the Indians had won the pennant in 97. They'd won the pennant in 95. They'd eliminated the Yankees in 97. Obviously, the Yankees won the World Series in 96, but the Yankees being down 2-1 to this good Cleveland team was a little bit surprising because of how dominant the Yankees regular season had been. But also up to that point, a lot of the teams historically that had these really crooked win total numbers, the 54 Indians, they didn't always win World Series. So it was not a foregone conclusion, although it was in the first round and then in this round, and then in the next round. The Yankees, they won game 4, I think, by 2 runs. They very easily could have lost this series, although, clearly they were the better team overall.
Game 4, 4-0 shutout.
Okay. Game 5 was a 2-run game.
So, 98 American League Championship Series, in the 12th inning, the score's tied 1-1. Travis Fryman bunted. Knobloch covers first base on the bunt. Jeff Nelson, the pitcher, his throw hits Fryman and rolls away. Instead of retrieving the ball, Knobloch argues with the first base umpire that interference should be called. Indians base runner Enrique Wilson, another future Yankee, was able to score from first base, giving Cleveland the lead in an eventual 4-1 victory. New York Daily News called him a blockhead, BLAUCH head, using, a play on words with his last name. David Cohn, who had done something very similar when he'd been with the Mets in the 1980s, when he'd been on the mound and was arguing with the umpire while the base runners rounded the bases, sort of comes up to Knobloch the next day. He's like, you have to own this. You can't make excuses. And the Yankees rally. They lose game 3. They don't rally right away, but then they win game 4, 5, 6. And then they sweep the San Diego Padres in the World Series. That 98 World Series is not really competitive. I want to talk a little bit real quick about game 1, but it's really not a very competitive series.
Yeah, the thing that always stands out to me about 98 is how weird it was seeing them celebrate. Like, I think the last ball was a ground ball to Brocious.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the old Jack Murphy Stadium, and you see the Yankees jumping in the air. And in 96, they won at home. In 99, they won at home, I believe, because it was a 4-game sweep that started in Atlanta. And in 2000, they won in Shea. So, New York. But in 98, you see like the jump up and there's just palm trees in the background. And it just always seemed very weird.
So I have to tell a little bit of a story here about this game one. Yeah, I actually have two stories about it. Yankees, Nate, they're in New York against the Padres. David Wells, who actually grew up in San Diego, is on the mound, and the Yankees go down 5-2 going into the seventh inning, as a matter of fact. And the two guys that have really been struggling are Knobloch and Tino Martinez. And there was a minister at our church, Pastor Ward, who was a big Yankee fan. And I remember after church that day, game one was on a Sunday, and he says, "Hey, here's what I think needs to happen tonight." He says the Yankees need to, in the first inning, Knobloch needs to hit a home run, then they need to load the bases, and Tino Martinez needs to hit a home run, and that'll be it. It'll get those two guys out of their slump, and the Yankees will be on their way to winning. That's not exactly what happens, but it does happen that in the seventh inning of that game, that with the Yankees down 5-2, Knobloch hits a 3-run home run to tie the game at 5, and then the bases do then get loaded right after that, and Tino Martinez hits a home run off Mark Langston to cap a 7-run inning, give the Yankees what at the time is a 9-5 lead. They go on to win the game 9-6, and the Padres in a lot of ways never really threatened the rest of the series. And I remember that the Pastor Ward at our church saying to me the following week, he was like, I called it. I told you exactly what would happen. So that's one of my stories. The other story that I have is that a former guest of ours on the Hello Old Sportscast, my freshman year roommate, Ben Meyer-Abbott, who was on to talk about baseball simulation games a few years back. When I first met him my freshman year, he was a Padre fan from San Diego. The first thing that he said to me was, "Hey, do you remember in 98 with the game tied in game one of the World Series, and Mark Langston throws a 2-2 pitch to Tino Martinez right down the damn middle, and Richie Garcia calls it a ball, and then on the next pitch, Tino Martinez hits a home run, and the Padres would have been out of that inning if Garcia called it a strike." To this day, there are Padres fans who swear that whole series would have been different if Rich Garcia had called the ball a strike. And I couldn't agree more that it would not have been any different. It also didn't necessarily help that Richie Garcia was the same guy who 2 years earlier in right field had made that terrible call with Tony Tarasco and the Orioles and the Jeffrey Mayer fan interference. But you're right. You can't argue that a 114 win team would not have won a World Series that they swept just because of one bad call. But I always have sort of two stories that kind of warm my heart about that 98 game one. And the 98 Yankees, they're not my favorite team of that era. I think we did an episode on the 96 Yankees, and they definitely hold a special place in my heart. But as far as just sheer wire to wire dominance, you can't beat that 98 team.
And there's some fun in that too. And I'm a little too young to really have been watching the ins and outs of that team every day, obviously the playoffs. But there's something to be said for a team that just beats the crap out of people every night and is a machine. So, you maybe don't have the great enduring memories that you do with a team that has to scratch and claw, but it can be fun too in its own way.
All right. So we always want to close with football, but before that, we want to kind of do the sort of the bits and pieces of some things that were going on in sports in 98. I have a couple things that maybe I'll get it started, and then I'll turn it over to you, Andrew. The 98 Olympics were held in Nagano, Japan. And it is, there was not a lot from this Olympics that I found. I did some research and couldn't find anything that was particularly interesting. A couple things that I found, it was the debut of snowboarding in the Olympics. First time snowboarding was an Olympic event. And then the other thing I had was there was a gentleman by the name of Philip Boit who competed in cross-country skiing. Do you know what was so interesting about him?
No.
he was the first Kenyan Winter Olympian.
Interesting.
So
the snowboarding thing, by the way, would be, and we're not the right people for this, and this podcast is going to go into the wee hours of the morning as it is. There is something to be said for the significance of that, in that it was a major crossover from the X Games kind of sports, the winter sports, the half pipe, into the Olympics, to the point where now there's a bunch of those. It's not remarkable, but that was seen as a significant thing at the time. Sort of the Gen X transfer into the Olympics and the mainstream. When you talk about Winter Olympics, figure skating is obviously the thing most people talk about. Tara Lipinski won the gold medal in the women's figure skating. Michelle Kwan won the silver. The U.S. women's hockey team won the gold medal for the first time. This was the first in the men's hockey. It was the first Olympics to utilize professional athletes for the hockey. 92, the Dream Team, and basketball was the first time to do that. I guess they didn't do it in 1994 in the Winter Olympics, but in 1998 they did.
Did they take that gap in the season like they always do these days?
This was the first time they did that.
First time they did that.
And I got a couple of things confused because the men's U.S. World Cup team also played horrible, but the Olympic hockey team played very poorly, and for good measure decided to trash their dorm rooms in the Olympic Village, used fire extinguishers all over the place, really just did not leave a good impression for Americans, and especially this hockey team. In addition to playing horribly, the Czech Republic won the gold in the Olympic hockey.
You may have found some, I didn't realize there was a World Cup. This was Brazil, right, in 98 that won the World Cup?
The 98 World Cup was held in France.
And it was France that won it, I think.
They beat Brazil 3-0 in the finals. The U.S. finished 32nd out of 32nd after having made it to the knockout stage in 1994, while the U.S. was the host of the World Cup in 1994. In 1998, they finished last in their group and last overall based on goal differential or whatever. There was a very interesting, and this was where I was getting this and the U.S. men's hockey team confused. There was a very interesting controversy where U.S. soccer coach in coming up with the lineup of the roster for the World Cup team, U.S. soccer coach Steve Sampson dropped the captain of the team, John Harkes, from the roster. And the reason speculated for a long time was that he was having an affair with the wife of one of his teammates, Eric Wynalda. He's denied this for a long time. There was a big controversy when he was cut from the team. There was controversy about what happened because they didn't really talk about it at the time. Years later, it appears, this article is from 2010. So even then was 12 years down the line, and 12 years ago now, or 13 years ago now. But there was controversy surrounding the U.S. team, and at the time it was seen as a major step back for the interests of United States soccer, where 94 had been sort of the coming out party for that. We hosted the World Cup. The U.S. did well by their standards at the time, and then in this they perform horribly. They finished in last, and I think that's why in 1999 when the women won, that was seen as kind of a big deal, especially after how badly the men had played in 98 in the World Cup. But France wins it on their home soil, overall is this story.
And it was their first ever World Cup championship. In fact, I think it was their first ever appearance in the finals. They had hosted it once before in 1938 and had lost to, they had not, Italy had won it in 38, and that was the last World Cup for 12 years. Teams had won in their home country before. In fact, the very first World Cup was in 1930, and Uruguay was the winner of that one. And some other teams had done it. It looks like England did it in 1966, West Germany in 74, Argentina in 78. So it was not uncommon for a team to win on its home soil, but France not only had never won on its home soil, they'd never won at all. So that's kind of a pretty cool moment for a team that had been involved in the World Cup for the very beginning, for basically a quarter century, to win it for the first time on their home soil. That's a pretty cool story.
Yep. And then some of these other ones I'll go through a little faster. Tennis, Pete Sampras won Wimbledon. We were still very much in the Pete Sampras era. Yana Novotná won the women's side in Wimbledon. The U.S. Open, Patrick Rafter won for the men. Martina Hingis won for the women. She also won the Australian Open later in the year. In golf, Marco Mira won the Masters. Tour de France, this was the last year before Lance Armstrong won 7 straight. And let me tell you how confusing that was to try to look that up, because I went to the Tour de France thing, and if you're not thinking about it right away, it looks like it was not contested for 7 straight years. The table doesn't say Lance Armstrong, whatever. It's just a dash, like when you look at the World Cups, and there weren't any because of World War II. So I was like, what did the Tour de France didn't go away? Like when? And then I realized what happened. So this was the last year before that. I thought this would have been the first year of that. In auto racing, Eddie Cheever won the Indy 500. More significantly, Dale Earnhardt won the Daytona 500 for the first time.
First and only.
Yes, this was seen as a huge. This was sort of the race that eluded him for years and years and years and years. I guess he'd been close a few times. He ends up winning this a little anticlimactically. It's under a checkered flag that he wins it, but he wins it. It's the big moment. And, you can't help but think that 3 years later, this was the same track and race that ended his life, but he did win it in 98 for the first time.
There's an author named Lee Montville who is a really good sports author. He wrote a really good Babe Ruth book, wrote a Ted Williams book, wrote a really good book about the 1969 NBA Finals with the Lakers and the Celtics. And he wrote a Dale Earnhardt book, and I own no auto racing books, but I picked this one up a couple of years ago just because I like his work. And Earnhardt has always been sort of a fascinating figure to me, even though auto racing, NASCAR, is far from a sport that I'm a fan of. And he writes in this book with Earnhardt that this, like, and he doesn't use this, but it's an analogy that you and I have used in the past. Earnhardt with this Daytona win kind of becomes like the Hulk Hogan of racing, where if you go to somebody and you say, name a race car driver, they don't know anything about anything. They're going to say Dale Earnhardt. He kind of became that after winning this Daytona. He becomes a part of not just the sports consciousness, but the American consciousness. So if Earnhardt's a fascinating figure, again, not a NASCAR fan. I'm not a NASCAR fan, but Earnhardt is a very fascinating figure. And the fact that maybe the greatest driver of all time wins the most important race of all time in 98, that's a big deal.
Absolutely. In horse racing, this was one of those years where a horse won. And I felt like this, the math doesn't, the history books don't back me up on this. I felt like as a kid, there was like a 6-year period where this happened 5 times, but this was definitely one of those years where Real Quiet won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, and then was nosed out on the Belmont, had the lead, ended up getting nosed out by a horse named Victory Gallop. So we were very close to having the first Triple Crown winner in what would have been at that point 20 years, because Affirmed won in 78. But Real Quiet is edged out by Victory Gallop in 98.
And it did happen again the following year in 99 with Charismatic.
Charismatic, yeah. Boxing, the thing I thought was in 98 that we'd have plenty of time to talk about, or that I'd want to spend some time talking about, actually wasn't until 99, which is probably a good thing.
What was that?
Lennox
was that
Lewis,
Holyfield Lewis?
A Holyfield Lewis draw. Lennox Lewis is the recognized heavyweight champion in 1998. Obviously, we're into the split belt era. He fights twice in 1998, not very, significant fights.
Did somebody get like really fat? Is that what happened?
What? Oh, the split belt era? That'd be the split pants era. That was when George Foreman had the title.
Incidentally, we do a pretty deep dive into that Holyfield Lewis fight in one of our very first episodes. I know that's 99, not 98. One of our very first episodes on the history of the World Heavyweight Championship. So check that out if you want to hear more about that.
So he fights twice that year, Shannon Briggs and Zeljko Marovic. Neither fight really remarkable from a historical standpoint. Most of the articles I saw talked about how this was the year where Oscar De La Hoya and Roy Jones Jr. kind of went back and forth on who was the best pound for pound boxer in the world. Unfortunately, they were several weight classes apart. So there was no chance they were ever going to actually fight each other. But both of them fought several times. In 98 was sort of their heyday. Jones Jr. especially. I guess both of them equally. And then Mike Tyson sort of on the periphery. In late 1998, he resumes his boxing career after fulfilling some important obligations in the beginning of 1998. But he fulfills his boxing, or he makes yet another return to the boxing ring in 1998. I guess he had to get some licenses reinstated and things like that.
All right. Before we get to football, do you want to give us a little rundown of the world of wrestling? You usually do this, and it's much earlier. This is probably a little bit of a different recap than
when we did 86. It was a good one to do. This is another good one. I will keep it brief for a variety of reasons. 1998, one of the most significant years in professional wrestling, really ever, but definitely in the last 40 or 50 years. We are at the height of what's called the Monday Night Wars between WWF and WCW. We go into 1998. WCW is firmly the number one company in the country. Hulk Hogan, the NWO, Sting. This is the year that sees the absolute. We talked before about guys like Dale Earnhardt and Mark McGwire shooting into the public consciousness. This happened this year in a huge way for Stone Cold Steve Austin with the WWF. He wins the WWF title at WrestleMania 14 in Boston in March. And becomes really a pop culture figure, MTV. People who didn't know much about wrestling since Hulk Hogan, some of them would still go, oh, what about this Stone Cold guy? That kind of thing. The WWF pulls ahead in mid-1998 in sort of the horse race with WCW. By the end of 1998, they are firmly entrenched. And then just two more big moments. In WCW, Goldberg's streak begins and actually ends too, but that is seen, that's sort of the dominant story there. And then sort of one of the most famous matches of all time, for better or worse, one of the most famous matches of all time in June of 1998, Mankind and The Undertaker, Hell in a Cell, where Mick Foley, Mankind, is thrown off and through the cell, and is quite the experience. So a huge year for wrestling from a sort of pop culture standpoint. It is very, very popular. Stone Cold Steve Austin in particular. And we're in the biggest sort of wrestling boom that we've been in since the late 80s with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah. So, because I was a fan up until like 93, and I didn't get into it during this time period. I didn't really start watching wrestling again until like 2007, 2008. But 98 was when I remember it kind of being something that a lot of people were talking about again. So this was, it definitely, it skyrocketed.
Yeah, and that continued for another couple of years, but 98 was definitely a very unique year. But I know that's not what people listen to this for, and I honestly couldn't do it justice in 5 minutes. So hopefully we just covered that as well as we could before we get into football.
Yes. So real quick, I know we probably want to close with the NFL because that's really our area of expertise, but 98, I think the big thing is Tennessee Volunteers, despite Peyton Manning going pro the year before, win it all with T. Martin at quarterback.
Yes, and I got to be honest, this one, oddly, I have a fond memory of, because I cannot remember what happened or for whatever reason, but in sometime maybe 96 era, Tennessee must have been on CBS a few Saturdays in a row, and I just kind of decided I was a Tennessee Volunteers football fan, and that was when Peyton Manning was the quarterback. And I will be honest, it did not last very long. It lasted maybe a year after this, but
you had a jersey.
I remember I had a Peyton Manning jersey, a Tennessee jersey. I still might somewhere. I would long ago have stopped fitting me. But I remember Peerless Price was on the team with Peyton Manning, but I remember he left and T. Martin takes over a quarterback. And the big thing with Peyton Manning, which continued for a while in the pros, was in college, it was he couldn't beat Florida. And they had good teams, but they couldn't beat Florida in the SEC. And finally, in 98, with a quarterback of much less distinction, they win the national championship. This is also the first year of the BCS championship game. There'd been some germinations of that in the 80s and 90s where they tried to get the number 1 and 2 team to play each other, but you had to, there was the Bowl Alliance, there was the Bowl Coalition, but you had to Can you get the Rose Bowl to buy in? Can you get this conference to buy in? What about Notre Dame?
What about the Rose Bowl game?
For 15 years, people killed the BCS, and they had a good point. But the thing I would always say is, this was better than what used to happen, where, well, the top two teams in the country aren't going to play each other because they're committed to playing in the Sugar Bowl and the Cotton Bowl, respectively.
Yeah.
This was better. This was better than the alternative. Now, what they have now is better, and won't get it. But so this was the first year of the BCS championship game, won by Tennessee over Florida State. The other college football things you have to talk about from 1998 is Ricky Williams. Ricky Williams runs away with the Heisman. He has numbers at Texas that are really out of this world, unbelievable. I'm going to try and pull him up real quick. It actually wasn't his last year at Texas, I believe. I think he played one more year at.
No, this is his last year.
Okay. So yeah, because that would be the 99 draft. Would have been when he was drafted. That's right.
That was when Ditka traded his whole team to be able to draft him with New Orleans.
So in 1998. That's not Ricky Waters, Ricky Williams. Let's just say he had a really good year.
I have it right.
You got it.
11 games, 361 carries, 2,124 yards. So that's over. That's like just under 200, 2,200 to be 200 yards a game. So he's just under that. 27 rushing touchdowns, having scored 25 the year before. He adds in a receiving touchdown for good measure. So 28 touchdowns in 11 games. That's 2.5 touchdowns a game for Ricky Williams in 1998. And you're right. Just a dominating season, wins the Heisman, makes All-American. And everybody thought he was headed towards a dominant NFL career, not least of which Mike Ditka, who, like I said, basically mortgaged his whole team to bring the guy in. So yeah, a dominant year by Ricky Williams for Texas in 98.
Army beats Navy 34-30, and there is a lawsuit because filed by two West Point cadets who were injured during the 1998 Army-Navy football game when a railing at Veterans Stadium collapsed and sent them plunging 12 feet to the ground onto the playing surface. So they ended up with a $1.1 million settlement out of that.
If we're talking about colleges that we're fans of or alumni of, this was the first full year that Boston University did not have a team. They had the team had been disbanded at homecoming weekend of 1997. So this is the first full year that Boston University does not have a football team.
They did that at homecoming weekend? That's a weird announcement to make.
Yeah, I think they did some weird things in those days.
The team has been disbanded. So as kind of a bridge between the college football and the NFL season, the 1998 NFL draft is known forever as the Manning Leaf draft. This is in April of 98. The Colts have the number 1 pick. The San Diego Chargers with number 2. You also had some really great guys who were drafted in that draft. Randy Moss, Charles Woodson, Alan Faneca, all ended up being Hall of Fame players. The big debate was, it was kind of split between which guy would be the better pro, Peyton Manning or Ryan Leaf. It's another one of those things that sometimes gets twisted that the Chargers picked Ryan Leaf over Peyton Manning, which they didn't. The Chargers picked Peyton Manning first, or the Colts picked Peyton Manning first. The Chargers took Ryan Leaf. Ryan Leaf had a very brief NFL career with no shortage of controversies. He screamed at a reporter in the locker room, I believe, at one point. Didn't play at all in 1999. Played in 2000. By 2001, got a handful of starts in Dallas, and by 2001, he was out of the league. Arrested a bunch of times. At one point, somebody pointed out that he kept getting arrested right around draft time every year, that there was some sort of thing there. Now, it does appear in the last 7-8 years, he has really gotten his life together. He's he's sober. He's very active in the recovery community. He's got a radio. Well, I was going to say he's got a job as a radio host and works for the Pac-12 network, which may not be stable employment at the moment. Does a little stuff with ESPN. So, he's finally gotten his life together. But, that was a big storyline going into that season. And unfortunately, not a happy ending for Ryan Leaf as far as his football career goes.
Yeah, and I've heard interviews with him over the last few years where it does sound like he's kind of turned himself around. You mentioned Moss. The thing that really kind of sticks out in my memory of this season is a couple of real powerhouse offensive performances in the National Football Conference in the NFC. Moss, as a rookie, is an all-pro with 1,313 yards and 17 touchdowns. Chris Carter, veteran, also starts 16 games, or plays in all 16 games, I should say. Moss doesn't even start until like 5 or 6 weeks into the season. He manages 1,011, and 12 touchdowns. The team finishes 15-1. Who is their loss to in this season?
Was it the Cleveland Browns in Cleveland?
It was not the Cleveland Browns. Tampa Bay, 27-24 on November 1st. They lose. And let me see if I can just pull up the scoring summary from that game. How close did that come to? So, so they actually have a lead of it's 17-7. They go up 24-17 in the third quarter. And then, 27, and then they, late in the fourth quarter, they're up 24-20, and then Mike Allstott scores the winning touchdown for the Bucks, and that's the only Viking loss of the season. Quarterback on this team is Randall Cunningham. Everybody sort of associates those Viking teams with Dante Culpepper a couple of years later, but this was during that time period where the Vikings seemed to have a different quarterback take them to the playoffs almost every single year. It was Warren Moon one year. It was Jim McMahon one year. This year, it's Randall Cunningham. Randall Cunningham, who in 1996 had retired from the Eagles. In 97, comes back, plays 3 games, or starts 3 games. And then in 98, he starts 14 games for the Vikings with a 13-1 record. Throws for, how many touchdowns does he have he throws for 34 touchdowns with only 10 interceptions, makes the all-pro team, the first team all-pro, Randall Cunningham. And then the following year is basically gone again. He only plays in 6 games. And I think it's Jeff George who is the starting quarterback for them for most of the year in 99. But this one year, it's sort of lightning.
Then it's Culpepper after that.
And then after that, it's Culpepper, yeah. But this one year, it's sort of lightning a bottle for the Minnesota Vikings. 15-1, dominant offense. And they lose in the NFC Championship game to an Atlanta Falcon team who sort of gets kind of gypped a little bit by history. And the reason they get gypped, I think, is because, first of all, they get smacked around by the Broncos in the Super Bowl. And second of all, they only win because Gary Anderson, the Vikings kicker, who had not missed a field goal all season, misses a field goal that would have given the game to the Vikings because I guess it would have tied the game, I guess, because I see the final score here was 30-27. So I guess that was it overtime?
That went to overtime, I believe.
It was an overtime game, and it was under the old overtime rules where all you needed was a field goal to win. And yeah, okay. Oh, okay. I see here. Okay. So here's what it was. Vikings are up 27-20 late in the fourth quarter with like just over 2 minutes left. Gary Anderson misses a field goal that would have put them up 10. Falcons get the ball, come down and score. Game goes to overtime. Teams trade punts, and then eventually Morton Anderson, another great kicker with the last name of Anderson, kicks another field goal to put the Falcons ahead 30-27, give them the win, send them to the Super Bowl against Denver. But that Falcon team, that was a pretty good team in and of itself. They were 14-2, coached by Dan Reeves. And this was the Dirty Bird Jamal Anderson year. And he put up just a monster year in 16 games, 14 touchdowns, 1,846 yards. So as insanely good as the Vikings passing game was that year with Moss and Carter and Randall Cunningham, the Falcons running game with Jamal Anderson and the Dirty Bird was just as good.
And then over in the AFC, you had the Broncos, who had won the Super Bowl the year before, had gotten the John Elway monkey off their back. He, had gotten to the Super Bowl all those times, gotten their butts kicked by much better NFC teams for the most part. Not for the most part every time. 3 years out of 4, they were there and got their butts kicked. They had become the first AFC team to win the Super Bowl in 1997 since 1983. They beat that Packers team that was the defending champion.
And that was the first AFC team to win a Super Bowl in 14 years since 83, I want to say.
Yep. You want to say that because I just said that?
All right.
So they win that Super Bowl. Elway, a lot of people expect Elway to retire. He comes back. Terrell Davis is still one of the best players in football. They start out 13-0. They're a real machine that year. They end up losing to the Kent Graham-led Giants in the 14th game of the season, and then lost the next week to the Dolphins, which would have been a very interesting matchup, because if they had been 14-0 playing the Dolphins who still the 72 Dolphins, the only undefeated team, the 85 Dolphins had beaten the Bears to hand them their only loss of the season, but they were looking past Kent Graham that day, and they regretted that. But
incidentally, the same pastor at our church who predicted the Tino and Knobloch thing also told me that morning that he thought the Giants were going to beat the Broncos. So he was on a real roll that year in 98.
Well, he was so much closer to the Lord, and the Lord, we all know, is very interested in New York sports. So they go third. They start out 13-0. They finish 14-2. They're obviously the number 1 seed. And
Terrell Davis has just you want to talk about monster rushing years, as crazy as Jamal Anderson's 18 and change. Mm-hmm. Terrell Davis, 2,008 yards, 21 touchdowns. He's MVP of the NFL. And it's crazy too, because Davis he rushes for his first 4 years in the NFL, 11-17, 15-38, 17-50, 2008. And then he's hurt, basically. The guy, after this season, Terrell Davis only plays in 17 more games, and his rushing totals the rest of the year, 211, 282, 701 in his last 3 years. His career is ostensibly over after this. Terrell Davis is a guy, he's basically in the Hall of Fame on the basis of 3 or 4 seasons, which is not crazy, not as crazy for a running back as it would be for some other positions, but still pretty crazy.
And then the other 4th team of significance to talk about is the Jets. The Jets, who had bottomed out at 1-15, they brought in Bill Parcells in 1997. They were 9-7 in 1997, had a chance to make the playoffs in the last day of the season. Didn't do that. I think they lost to Detroit that day, or Seattle, one of those 2 teams. So they go into 1998 with high expectations for the first time in a little while. And for one of the very few times ever they live up to those expectations, they go 12-4 with Vinny Testaverde at quarterback. That had been one of their drawbacks in 97, was Parcells couldn't make up his mind between quarterbacks. 98, they go with Testaverde. Curtis Martin is there by 98. They start out actually 0-2. With losses to the 49ers and the Baltimore Ravens. And then they go on a run where they win 12 of their last 14 games and finish the season. They're 6-4, and they win their last 6 games to go to 12-4. It's a team very much in the Parcells mold. He's got a lot of guys from the Patriots who'd been there, and this is the best Jets team in a long time.
And they lead the AFC Championship game 10-0 in the third quarter. And then, Denver scores. And then on the ensuing kickoff, the Wind takes the ball, the kickoff from Jason Elam and Dave Meggett. It's can't get to it. And the Broncos recover. They then get another field goal, tie the game at 10. And this game that the Jets had led 10-0 in the third quarter, they end up losing 23-10. Following year, everybody's expecting them to be great. Testaverde tears his Achilles on the very first. I think it's in the first half. It's definitely in the first game of the season. Parcells leaves the Jets. Then there's the whole Belichick thing. So sort of you look at these teams and these franchises, and it's like you'll never be back there again. And up 10-0 in the third quarter against the defending champions in the AFC Championship game, and then you realize it's all downhill from there. I had two other things I wanted to note about the season and a couple of these teams. First of all, Elway is named MVP of this Super Bowl, which he had not had a great game in the previous year in Super Bowl 32 against the Broncos. In this one, he's 18 for 20
Packers.
Against the Packers. I'm sorry, the year before. This one, he's 18 for 29, 336 yards. So 336 yards on 18 completions is pretty good. Runs for a touchdown. And so he did have that famous helicopter play in the Super Bowl before against Green Bay, but this is definitely his better Super Bowl. And he goes out on he's got to be the only guy ever to win Super Bowl MVP and then immediately retire. I can't think of who else that would have been. I mean, even Brady stuck around for a year or two afterwards. So that's impressive. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is just sort of a apropos of nothing at all, but that Atlanta Falcon team in 98, their quarterback is Chris Chandler. And Chris Chandler has a decent enough year, but he does run into some injuries. He only gets to start 14 games. So the two different backup quarterbacks get the start for the Falcons in those other two teams. One is a guy by the name of Tony Graziani, who I have to admit I know very little about. It looks like he played 3 years with the Falcons and never started more than 3 games in a season. The other backup quarterback who gets into a game for the Falcons, who gets a start that year, is a guy by the name of Steve DeBerg. And Steve DeBerg gives me hope because he is 44 years of age, which means that if I want to become an NFL quarterback, I still have 4 years in which I could potentially do that. Steve DeBerg, who had been the 49er quarterback before Joe Montana in 1978, who hadn't played in an NFL game since 1993, and who one of those years in between 93 and 98 was the Giants quarterback coach. And he gets a start. Which maybe that says more about the Giants.
He was probably the best quarterback on the roster or in the building most of those days.
Yeah, exactly. So just an interesting aside. Steve DeBerg is one of those guys. Gets a start for a team that's on its way to the Super Bowl. Yeah, it's an exciting season in the NFL in 98 with some teams. I mean, it's the only year the Falcons are really any sort of a contender, at least as constituted. 3 or 4 years later with Vic, they come back into it. It's the only playoff year for the Jets in the Parcells era. It's the Vikings are back in 2000. They make the NFC title game against the Giants, and that's when they get they get smacked 41-0. But it's sort of like this weird, like the Cowboys are done, the Favre Packers are done. We're not at the sort of greatest show on turf. And then after that, the Patriots and all that type of stuff. Manning's just coming into his own. 98's kind of this weird year where you get a lot of guys and a lot of teams and a lot of stories that you don't get in any other season in that time frame.
Couple other things to touch on. This was CBS's first year back with football. After losing it, going into the 93 season, they had lost the NFC package to Fox. You can listen to our Fox Sports episode for more on that. This year, they got the AFC package, taking it from NBC. The significant thing that year, and you see it, we talked about when Fox came on and the score was on the screen the whole time. CBS's big innovation was the first down marker, and
on the field,
Yep, and I can't imagine football without it. And we could talk about there being too much stuff on the field now, and screens looking too busy. I will defend forever the first down line being on the screen. It makes things a lot easier. This was also the year with the Thanksgiving coin toss situation between the Lions and the Steelers in overtime, when the Steelers, I think it was Jerome Bettis.
It was Bettis, yeah.
there was confusion over whether he called heads or tails, and the Lions ended up winning. So they implemented a rule where the coin has to be called before it's in the air now to eliminate any of that confusion. Just a couple of things, Arizona made the playoffs for the first time since 1982. 1982 was that weird strike year, so it was their first playoff appearance in a normal season since 1975.
And their first in Arizona, too, because they'd still been in St. Louis in 82, yeah.
And they actually win a playoff game. They beat the Cowboys before losing to Minnesota. And then just one playoff game, which is a famous game, and we'd be remiss to not mention the game they call the Catch 2, the wild card game between San Francisco and Green Bay in the wild card round, where Steve Young throws the ball to Terrell Owens, who makes the catch in the end zone to win the game 30-27, who, obviously the 49ers lose the next week to Atlanta. So it's not a catch that people talk about to this day, but also really the last great Steve Young moment of his career.
Yeah, he only plays one more season, and it's only 3 games. And then I think he gets knocked out with a concussion early in that 99 season and just never comes back.
Yep. So Super Bowl was a little bit anticlimactic, but, plenty of interesting storylines in the season.
Yeah, and I think you just kind of look back and you just kind of, not to get weirdly philosophical at 10:38 on a Wednesday night here, but you look back and it's like all these guys who, such just like key sports figures of our childhood or of those, teenage years that you just don't realize how long it's been since they were around. I mean, Jordan, obviously, but, there's kids these days who probably don't know much about McGwire or Terrell Davis or even, Randy Moss maybe, but some of these guys, you just realize, you talked about Jerome Bettis, like these were guys who were just household names 25 years ago. And now, a lot of them, we talk about things that sort of invaded the popular mindset. Everybody knew what the Dirty Bird was for a couple of years. It's another one of those things. So it's in a lot of ways, and I guess it's always the case, and especially the case, given that the time period in our lives when this was, but you remember so many of these things, not just as moments, but also as part of the pop culture, whether it's the football stuff with the Dirty Bird or whether it's the home run chase or all this stuff. So this was a really, really, there's just so many stories in sports in 1998, and glad we were able to get through a lot of them here tonight.
Yep. And then as the length of this will tell you, we probably could have done 2 more hours and cut it into a few reasonably sized episodes, but hopefully we did everything justice. Absolutely.
And we appreciate you all. And if you like what we do here, but you want to hear us go way back, we've got some other episodes with, like I said, 1920, 1941, and we're going to do 1923 later this year. So if you like the idea of a year episode, but don't want to do anything from when you were alive, then just be patient because we've got more older ones coming. But until then, it's very late, and I maybe in 1998 when I was 15 or 16 years old, I could still have some energy after 10:40 at night. Although knowing me, probably not. But
wrap it up.
I'm tired. Andrew's tired, and we'll catch you on the next episode. But until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I wanted to thank you for stopping by to listen to another episode here on the Sports History Network. Our podcasters are passionate about uncovering and sharing sports stories from yesteryear. And if you didn't know it already, we have over 30 shows across the network covering all sorts of sports history topics. In fact, here's a glimpse into one of our awesome podcasts here on the network.
With every race, every qualifying run, and every pit stop, Tim Coffeen would feel the pressure and excitement. With his own podcast on the Sports History Network called Tim Coffeen Talks IndyCar and Racing History, Tim will share those very same racing emotions and memories with his listeners. Learn, laugh, and enjoy the world of IndyCar racing through the eyes of Tim Coffeen.
How about that? I bet you're super hyped to go listen to that new podcast, right? Well, to learn about this show and all the other podcasts on the network, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Head over there today to find your next favorite sports history podcast.